Yeah,
Okay,
now
now
we're
it says
live.
we're live. Yeah.
Brilliant. Today I'm with Humane Mind for a debate or chat or sort of just conversation about politics, namely our respective ideologies that we follow. Capitalism, in Humane's case, and
Hmm.
so the mix of like socialism, communism, other far left branches in my case. I wouldn't exactly pinpoint myself on one, but certainly off to the far
Okay.
left. Anyway,
All
take it
right. Yeah,
away.
and we're gonna try to keep this conversation to economics, although we disagree on a bunch of other points. I want to because the original pitch for the debate was communism versus capitalism, right?
Mm.
If my understanding is correct.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So because of that, I want to keep it more towards economics, although we may branch out into other things. I want to kind of every time we do, I like to get off on tangents as well when I'm talking to
Likewise.
people. But every time we do, we try to make it come back into the topic of economics in general.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so the
yeah.
reason, and thank you for having me on here. It's in my experience, it's a little rare to have someone who is on the opposite side willing to have a discussion in general. So,
Well, lots of people
uh,
don't view them as particularly like useful, and I find that it's good to have conversations. Though to be fair, I'm quite like sympathetic to the view that they're a little bit fruitless at times.
yeah. Well, I like debates in general because the more it either you realize that some of the arguments you had were weak and were easily knocked down, or you try to improve. I mean, so you can improve them later, or you're like, oh, I didn't think this part through, and it causes you to try to rethink how you could reword something or how you could present something in a manner that's more easily understood, things like that. So it helps you to refine your own ideas, and in some cases, when you're just outright wrong, it helps you to see, oh, yeah, I had this all wrong, and I was missing this particular piece of information, and
Hmm. Yeah, no,
so I
exactly.
think they are useful in that.
Plus, it's a good speaking exercise, and I like
Yes.
expressing my ideas. Anyway, would you like to start, or shall I?
Okay. So the what stirred this debate is we did a video a couple over a month now about questions that capitalists have for socialists, and you did a live stream
Response to
rebuttal of
that.
that. Yeah, and so rather than doing a back and forth and a back and forth, I was like, okay, let's just have a debate. And really, I wanted to talk about the question that I raised in that video, but I mean, we're not limited to that sort of thing. And I wanted to, because you're the way you address them, I thought was kind of a granted, given the context of that video, I could see why you would come to that conclusion. But I wanted to
Hone
try
in on the
to
part you emphasize.
hone in on what the point of those questions were, and get the idea of that across. So what I
Yeah,
was saying in that video is you could have an island with 10 people and they could practice capitalism. But for some reason, when it comes to socialism, every time I'm talking to someone who has a socialist ideology, they always want to make it bigger. It always has to be bigger. It wasn't big enough. It needs to be, we need to have more people involved. And I'm like, that seems kind of, to me, that seems like if it doesn't work on the small scale, it shouldn't work the bigger it gets. In order for something to succeed when it gets large, it has to be stable in a smaller environment.
I mean, I can see where you're coming from. I mean, lots of socialists will say of countries like the USSR and even small like Cuba and North Korea and stuff that,
Mm-hmm.
oh, well, because the ideologies practiced here did not work, that socialism needs to be bigger. And then you can see why people would say in response to that, well, if you're not saying it can work on this small scale, why should we try it on a larger scale? And I think there's two sort of responses you can have to that. I mean, firstly, you can say that these small examples were not even following the tenets of socialism. They weren't worker
Okay.
owned. They weren't sort of shared products, and they weren't. You didn't have workers owning their own labor. You didn't see like a common collective of people making decisions. It was like in North Korea's case, it's literally an
Oh yeah.
autocracy.
Yeah.
But on the second scale, the reason that you need a sort of wider global worker-owned society is because when you have these small societies of worker ownership that exist in a wholly capitalist market and economy, it's not going to be able to compete, which isn't a like
Hmm.
problem of the initial society. It's more a case of the fact that capitalism tends to like exclude and ostracize these societies. So, for instance, you look at nations like I mentioned, Cuba,
Mhm.
Venezuela, all these places that have like socialist in the title, and regardless of whether they're socialist or not, you can see the US, for instance, the world's largest economy and certainly the most important and influential nation,
Yeah.
placing embargoes and trade blockades and even intervening in these countries. You see, like the EU, a free trade bloc, it's immensely wealthy compared to some of the European nations outside of the trade bloc. And that's because capitalist nations like to concentrate their productivity on the areas that are capitalists. So they're saying if you subscribe to our free trade agreements and markets, then yeah, you will do well. But these small nations outside it, they're not going to be as affluent. And that's why you see a lot of nations that don't follow traditional neoliberal capitalism not do so well. As a result, and like you said, an island of 10 people, if
Mhm.
that island existed in a like little bubble outside with no like connection to the outside world, yeah, it could very well easily be socialist. In fact, I would argue it would be better for the 10 people to work
Hmm.
together than to be sort of aiming to profit off each other and aiming to commodify any item or resource they found on the island, because that's going to harm your survival if you're constantly having to compete with people who are sort of you could be much better working with if you sort of group together and worked together. Um, but
Well, that seems to kind of contradict what you were saying a little earlier, because you were saying some of these other countries like Cuba is ostracized by the United States. Well, wouldn't that effectively put it into a little bubble where it should be self-sustaining? It's like, okay, they don't want anything to do with us. We don't want anything to do with them. Okay, we now have achieved our little bubble. But then you were saying that nations that trade with one another are more wealthy, like the EU is, you know, I guess I would kind of disagree with you that they are more wealthy as far as economic growth compared to the countries that are not a part of the EU. But I think the general point was that they are more wealthy than a lot of other countries because they are trading with one another, and that's a point I can agree with you. But it seems like it isn't trade kind of against the socialist ideology. I thought you were, because I mean so are you advocating more towards a barter system with socialism,
um,
or
I mean, not so much. Like you still, certainly in socialism, you can still have like money representing value. It's
okay?
more the more criticisms that people have or socialists have of the current system is that labor is commodified and profited off, and you have people profiting off the work of others. So workers do X job and produce Y value, and then Y value is turned into Z value, thus diverting
Mm-hmm.
profits to the boss who did not do the work and giving scraps of the initial value to the workers back. So the workers are then having to like sell their labor to survive, despite doing the labor in the first place, which makes the people on top
Okay.
rich. So coming back to what you said about Cuba, I said that an island that was
Mm-hmm.
completely oh wait, it's like you can't if it's only that island and there's only 10 people on it, then yeah, a socialized society could work because like you have the 10 people working together. But Cuba and any country on the planet today certainly is not an isolated case. Cuba is obviously like what right next to only a few hundred miles away from America. It's
Yeah.
easy to blockade with naval armies and stuff like America have done. It's easy to like stop
Well,
certainly in a globalized like economy and world. If you block the trade and the flow of capitalism going to one from one country to another, you're going to harm them, which is why Cuba obviously doesn't have a lot of modern technologies we sort of take for granted. I mean, it's worth pointing out that even with their obviously it's not a socialist nation, but the areas of
yeah.
socialism they followed a bit closer, like healthcare, for instance, has worked a little bit in their favor. But that's sort of off the point. Really, looking at isolated countries that call themselves socialist and saying, "Oh well, you can't have a small socialist nation because look at these nations," is sort of contradictory to the point. Because if you have a capitalist market around this small like nation, and especially a capitalist market that's going to do what it can to sort of quash dissenters, in the sense of like stopping Cuba from growing as a nation, you're always going
Okay.
to sort of see um, these places not do as well or not have as much wealth.
So I'm a little confused when you say the U.S. keeps Cuba from growing, but you also said that an isolated system that was purely socialist would, according to you, do better because so I know I'm trying to get my head around this idea. You're saying that Cuba is being held back because they aren't allowed to trade because the U.S. is doing embargoes and is blocking them off from people who want to trade with Cuba. And I think that that's inherently a bad system, a bad way to deal with Cuba. I forget who said this, but there's a quote concerning sanctions, which is effectively, blocking trade. And I forget, it was some general, it was either general or an economist who said this. And he said, what sanctions are is, or we do to ourselves with sanctions during times of peace that our enemies attempt to do to us during times of war. It's basically we're cutting off our own supplies by participating in that. So I understand your argument against blockading Cuba, because I'm in agreement with you there. I think we should be actively trading with Cuba, and I think the more we trade with Cuba, the more they would realize the way that they're running their system is not as good as the way the United States is, because like you were saying, the United States has advanced. We are way ahead technologically. So if we started trading more with Cuba, they'd be like, oh, we're stuck back in the 60s. They would realize how far behind the times they are and be like, maybe we didn't put our money on the right horse because the United States has passed us up by so much. Maybe we got something wrong here. So I think by trading, they might come to that realization. But the thing that I'm not certain why you're coming to this conclusion is when you're saying because Cuba is blocked off completely, it prevents them from growing. But by your viewpoint of the world, that should be the best thing for Cuba, because it effectively allows them to have a self-contained system of socialism. I mean, granted, they're not purely socialistic, right? They've got problems and they're not following everything to the letter. But you would think that some place like Cuba, because they are cut off from the rest of the world, if they followed the tenets of socialism exactly, the embargoes wouldn't affect them. They should be self-sustaining and they should be growing faster and eventually become a world superpower.
I mean, I think there's been a little bit of a mistranslation between what I was saying and what you've interpreted. For instance, with the I'm saying that a small island could become successful, like independent of the rest of the world, if it was truly independent. When I say that, I mean, like, if you imagine like 10 people just get stuck on an island somewhere, like those 10 people are far better off working together than they are if they just like cordon off parts of the island and say, oh well, if to have my clean water, you must trade me your fresh coconuts or whatever. Like in that scenario, the one you gave me, like you need to sort of work together to survive. With Cuba, I'm not saying that. Firstly, it's not a socialist nation. Obviously, it's not. But it's not purely socialism. It's actively a totalitarian state. Like you've got the Castro sort of administration controlling their workers, and taking the benefits of their work for themselves, and that isn't socialism whatsoever. But as regards to like the what's it called, the blockades and stuff, it's not a case that like literally ships surround the island and just like blow up anything trying to come towards it. It's a case that lots of trading that Western nations can do have been limited to Cuba. So there is still trade. There are still like things coming in and out of Cuba. It's just vastly reduced compared to other Western nations. And so like it's not a case of like Cuba is literally only Cuba, because you can go on holiday to Cuba if you're from certain nations. Obviously, like you can't go straight from. I believe they took it off recently, but you can't go straight from America to Cuba and vice versa. But there is still travel there. It's just limited compared to the rest of the world. And that is, I'm not saying that if Cuba was completely blocked off, it would be able to survive, because obviously the world we're in now, you still need to trade. And Cuba, like they still export stuff and make produce from that. But as regards to their success as a nation, I think really like you need to look at the sort of way that capitalism as a global force has sort of distributed wealth for workers as a whole. not just focusing on like small nations where dissent from capitalism has sort of led to this not quite not very good state where like totalitarianism is in place, because that's always going to happen within one state. You need to sort of look at capitalism as a global system that needs replacing in a global way. So instead of like confining your change to one nation and then keeping the rest of the market, which is obviously going to lead to that nation not doing anywhere near what your ideology would suggest, but instead see the workers of the world saying, no, we need reform, and then reforming the entire economy so that you have a reflection of what is actually intended from socialism.
Well,
Sorry if that
that
was
to
a bit
me
of a ramble.
seems like a huge problem for socialism because you need. So here's my comparisons. Look at all of the countries that had communist intentions and whether they succeeded or not. So you're talking about Cuba. I think you would agree that it is at least partially following some of the tenets that Marx proposed, even though it devolved into a authoritarian dictatorship down there. It at least practices some of the tenets behind communism. And I mean, I don't know if you agree with that completely, but most people would recognize Cuba as a communist country as opposed to a capitalist country. Or do you think that it would be, or do you think it has some other form of economic system at play there?
Uh, I mean, it's not capitalist, but at the same time, I wouldn't say it's like. I
Okay,
mean, yeah, fine. Their citizens
so
get healthcare, but
okay, so
it's not like.
so would you say that it's more communist than capitalist?
I mean, the thing is, but with communism, because it's such a sort of like defined set thing, because it's got such a
Yeah.
specific sort of abolished class and like
Okay.
workers earning
Uh,
their produce like as a fifth aim. It's like I don't think you can really just apply it as like, oh, it's partly communist, because you can't
well, okay, that's kind of the issue that I'm trying to establish here, because we've looked at countries that aren't completely capitalist, and we've looked at countries that you would say aren't completely communist. And I would say compare the two. And one example I would give of this is Zimbabwe versus Botswana. These are two neighboring countries. And actually, Zimbabwe is supposed to be a more resource rich country than its neighbor Botswana. And yet, Zimbabwe has a more communist style of economy and is the absolute poorest country in the world. And its neighbor Botswana is one of the fastest economically growing countries in the world. Or sorry, not in the world, in Africa. So those two countries are side by side. And what the difference is well, I mean, there's several differences, but one of the big differences between Botswana and Zimbabwe is Zimbabwe has a enforced communistic or communist style economy, whereas Botswana is gearing more towards owning personal property, owning private property, and trading with not only itself but with its neighbors.
um
So whereas Zimbabwe tends to close itself off.
I mean, again, like we look at Zimbabwe and you look at the recently deposed leader Robert Mugabe,
Oh yeah, Mugabe.
um
Yeah.
and it's like he was essentially a dictator. There was very little freedom of press. There
Okay.
was severe like civil liberties and human right infringements, and that's sort of antithetical to the idea of communism and the idea of worker ownership. Like Mugabe,
Okay.
like yeah, of course, there's massive problems in Zimbabwe. Like no one's like going against that, and certainly no one would ever like use Zimbabwe as an example of how a country should be. But the situation is not one that is the fault of communism. It's a case of a military-backed person like Mugabe who has the sort of like what's the word? Don't want to say education, but he's got the position to manipulate people in Zimbabwe
Okay.
um,
Well,
to essentially
well,
con people into following his revolution against the previous regime there. And obviously, as what usually happens when you confine to um, like one nation, Mugabe's lot just sort of took power, and now this current revolution kicking out Mugabe, that's probably going to be the same thing because it's the same sort of rich,
yes.
influential people controlling the people within one state. But then you can't call that communism because at no point are the
No,
workers ever.
I understand that you can't call that communism, but I would say you can't call Botswana capitalist either, because they have some very strict rules. They have some very very non-capitalistic laws in place that prevent people from behaving in ways that they otherwise would, because
So
they're
like
afraid of
regulations and stuff.
yes, so regulations and laws preventing people from doing things that are would actually be encouraged by capitalism. So I guess the point of the confusion is, do you think that communism is purely an economic system, or do you think it's a political system as well? Because you're talking about Cuba, it would be more communist, except it's run by a dictator. And this is often a criticism people have when they're talking about the USSR. Well, it was communistic, but it was run by people like Stalin, and and all these other examples, like it wasn't true communism, it was Leninism. It wasn't true communism, it was all these other things. So it always seems like when they're talking about communism, in my mind, communism is an economic system. But when people say that wasn't true communism, it's usually because they're talking about the political side. They talk about the leader of that communist society. They're like, yeah, in Venezuela, it wasn't communism that caused that. It was their political system. It was their leaders. It was the people who are running things that did something wrong. So that's a point of confusion for me.
Okay, well, I mean, I understand that. I can understand sort of where you're coming from with like the economic and political differences. I mean, I'm of the opinion that they're sort of intertwined anyway. Like the
Okay.
whole sort of point is that you don't you abolish class and you have workers owning their labor and stuff. And yeah, obviously that's set like politics and economy, they are separate things, but they're very mixed. And when you say that, oh yeah, politically communism was not followed in the USSR, but economically it was, or sort of lots of areas followed it. I mean, that's only true in that like private companies or like the previous bourgeoisie was disposed of. Like beyond that, there like a lot of the stuff just carried over. Like you've got Stalin essentially controlling produce, controlling industry, and workers being completely phased out. You got workers not having the ability to sort of do as they wish. They don't have the freedom to act how they want. They are controlled by a state, which again is antithetical to the idea of a communist class abolished system. And yeah, obviously economically, fine, things were in control by a single group, but under communism, that single group is the entirety of society, as everyone is the same class, the same status, because there's no longer a caste class system. Obviously, that wasn't the case in the nations often cited as communist. Interestingly, Venezuela actually had a rather large private sector despite being supposedly socialist. And obviously, it's quite a unique case because they sort of base like their economy on oil prices, which is why in the 2000s they had a massive boom and they were sort of able to do all right for themselves. And then when oil prices plummeted, partly enforced by US embargoes, they
didn't divest in anything else. It was all oil. So.
Exactly, yeah. And the Chavez administration was notoriously sort of like corrupt as well. So I mean, I don't think you can really cite that as an example. Anyone really can cite it as an example of socialism.
Okay. So you brought up a question, and I would like to circle back to what we were just talking about. But you brought up something when you were just talking, where you were saying under Stalin, people weren't allowed the freedom because they were under an authoritarian rule. Right? They weren't allowed the freedom to act in the way that they would. Well, this is something I brought up against socialism in that video as well, is how if somebody wants or doesn't want to participate in socialism, isn't that restricting their freedom by saying, no, you have to participate in socialism, you can't go off and do your own thing? And when somebody comes to that position, is like, no, I don't want any part of your society, I don't want to be in your socialism, I'm going to go over here and do my own thing, leave me alone. Well, that creates a problem for socialism, at least from my experience of what people I've talked to other people about it, is you're not allowed to just go off and do your own thing. And
but what do you
so that raises problems.
What do you mean by, like, for instance, what do you mean like do your own thing or like have your freedom infringed? What are you sort of thinking of?
Well, okay. So can you go off, own your own section of land, farm it yourself, go hunting on your own property, have your house, have your family in like 1 acre of a field, and just be self-sustaining, like an isolated, hey, this is where my family lives, and nobody else can come and use my stuff, and just let me have my land, my farm, and I'll provide for myself and my family. Is that something that would be allowed under socialism?
I mean, I suppose the sort of idea there is that the idea, oh, it's my farm, it's my land. Like when people say no private property, they don't mean like literally your pen or your toothbrush or anything. They mean like cordoning off sections of land and declaring it your own. Like for instance, people who just go and buy their own island and say this island is mine. Like that is sort of what people oppose. And as regards to someone saying, oh, this is my farm, my house, it's like land has no like true owner. Land has no original owner. All land was just there, and people settled there. And originally, back in like right in like our ancestors, like in the early days of humanity, like land was obviously like shared. There was no concept of having my stake in the land. And obviously, it's only sort of in recent human history that we see borders being drawn and land being declared their own, and colonialism and imperialism, and eventually transitioning into the sort of modern neoliberal age of capitalism. And the idea that like you have people saying, "Oh, well, this is my house or my land, and you cannot come here and will be self-sufficient," is sort of ignoring the fact that eventually or previously that land was not theirs, and at some point in time, their land was stolen off the previous occupants, and that's sort of a point of everyone's land. There's no sort of place where like one guy is just, oh yeah, all my family just comes from this exact 1 acre of land. There's no need for land. Sorry, I'm coming to the end in a second. So I was going on a little bit. Land like should not be subject to one person or like a few people to decide it above the rest of society. And I would actually argue that freedom for that one person supposedly is an infringement and a betrayal of the freedom of everyone else, because you're cordoning off land for yourself at the denigration of everyone else.
Okay, so there are places on the United States that are not currently owned, like Antarctica. Antarctica, they signed a treaty, and so no country can actually make a valid claim to Antarctica. So if the entire world was socialist, and you're like, nobody can own anything, if somebody moved to Antarctica and wanted to establish a new city or new colony that was not a part of the socialist government, would they be allowed to do that? Or is that stealing from the entire population by going and moving to an area that is literally unoccupied? I guess maybe Antarctica is an extreme example. What about like a desert, the Sahara Desert? Somebody could go out and live in the Sahara Desert. It's not an occupied territory. They're not going and invading somebody else's land in their region. They're not going and taking someone else's home. But there are nomads who live in the Sahara Desert, and somebody else could go to the Sahara Desert, establish a colony there, just so they could get out of the socialist society. They just say, hey, I don't want to participate in socialism. Do they have that option? And the follow-up to that is, how do you keep someone from doing that? How do you prevent someone from not participating in your socialist society?
Okay. Well, firstly, I'd like to say that, and that treaty you mentioned around Antarctica is coming to an end in like, I think 20 years. I think it's 2040 or something, which goes to show you that whilst perhaps back then the people who made that deal would be long gone, our generation, or my generation certainly, will have to deal with Antarctica potentially being targeted by those who'd be interested in the oil reserves underneath it, for instance.
Yeah. Oil reserves, all kind of mineral deposits. Yeah.
Exactly. And that just goes to show that, like with anything under capitalism, really, you got to worry that people are going to make a profit out of what should be protected land. And for me, at least, it's certainly scary that someone could be digging up ice sheets just to get at a resource like oil, just to make a profit out of it. Like, but as regards to,
I find that scary, but that's just me.
Well, you don't find like, I don't know, like
I don't find it scary that they're digging up under ice sheets, because I'm like, well, what are the ice sheets doing right now? They're just frozen water. That's what they're doing right now.
They'll melt, though, won't they? Anyway,
yeah, that's a tangent. Let's get back to your point.
But like you were saying about people moving away from socialism, I mean, it's a weird sort of question, because it's a bit like it's almost a bit like Matrixy, like saying like, oh, what if there was a Neo who said, no, I'm gonna reject the system, and like Mr. Smith's gonna come after him. But as in a sense, but like people moving around,
Well,
socialism is about freedom, and people are free to move around, but you can't just say like, I don't think you'd be able to just declare a bit of land your own. That sort of infringes on the freedoms of other people. Because imagine someone just says, "Oh, this whole land is mine." That isn't like that land is no one's, and I don't think to essentially claim it as yourself is a sort of theft from society in a way. I know it's
all
a
right.
weird sort of concept because like we are so used to having item A has owner X, but if everyone is the owner of the land, if society as a whole owns land, and then one person says no, this is mine, in a way that is theft in itself. But like you were saying, nomads like they're fine to do their own thing because nomads like the whole point is that
Yeah.
everyone owns everything, so nomads are fine to do their own thing, and no one's saying, oh, you may not live here. But what is being said, if that person says no, you cannot live here unless you pay me or you pay me rent, then there's a problem. Um, like you get, I find it
Well,
a little bit weird as a question to be honest, because it's like, well,
I think so. I think that contradicts your position on personal property. So I live in my own house right now, and I sleep in my own bed. I could sleep in my bed, and then somebody could just walk into my under your socialism. What's somebody can just walk into my house and start using my kitchen because I'm not using my kitchen right now, right?
um, well, I wouldn't quite agree with that.
Or they
That's
could,
not
you know, they could set up a rock band in my garage and start playing. It's like, hey, you're not using your garage right now. You're sleeping in your bed. Go.
no, but this is like that's not what
Where's
because I mean, yeah, like oh, that's not really going to happen, is it? No one's going to be like as obtuse to be doing that. But like the idea that because
well,
for
okay,
instance, like you
that's
say,
kind
I
of a
could.
little more extreme, but
I mean, I get what you're saying about like, oh, everyone owns everything, but like you still have like a house. What people mean is that you couldn't just like take an entire like part of moorland or field or farm, like people like corporations and stuff do at the moment, and say, no, this is our land. Like for instance, in parts of Saudi Arabia, you've got oil companies from the West just planting them these massive oil refineries, and sort of hiring private militias to protect them from the locals and saying, no, this is property of I don't know, Oil Corp USA. You cannot go here. If you do, you'll be shocked because it's our private property. That is the sort of thing that would be stopped. Like you can't just essentially cordon off parts of land and say this is ours and you will get kicked off. As regards to your own like house, like yeah, that's fine because the whole point is that everyone has part of like society. Like everyone has a part in a place to live. And so yes, you absolutely would have a house. Like no one's saying because I think
so how
people
do
have the
you?
idea of socialism and communism, all that being like, oh, everyone's going to be poor, everyone's going to be living for scraps in like some massive like slum. When in reality, we forget how much land and how much property is owned by those right at the top. So really, for you and I, people just, I mean, I don't know how wealthy you are or not, but I know I'm working class and our situation would not really be negative at all. It'd be positive because we'd suddenly find ourselves not having the burdens of a capitalist like economy. Um, and all that is perhaps, yeah, if you own like an island or like thousands of like a massive part of rainforest, yeah, fine, you're not going to have as much wealth. But once land and wealth is redistributed, people for the most part are going to be better off. So you're not going to see people having to crowd into certain areas to survive. You're not going to see these sort of overpopulation issues we sort of have made our own problem out of because of the capitalist mean of production. It's like a mode of distribution even. So the idea of someone sort of running into your house and be like, yeah, I must stay here isn't going to happen because you have a sort of much fairer means of distribution. So you're not going to see the problems we do and we conceptualize in a capitalist world.
Okay, so instead of it being a house, how do you grow crops at all under your system? Because you need to section off an area of land to plant and water and you know add pesticides to and to keep and maintain. That's why we have large acres of farm in order to grow crops. But if nobody owns any land and they can't section off fields in order to grow crops, how do you grow crops? Because if I can't own a section of land and use it to plant my harvest, somebody else can use that same land and build a skyscraper in the middle of it. So I've got this field. I went in and planted seeds. I go to sleep. Some days, next day, oh, hey, nobody owns this. I'm going to build a skyscraper here. It's because it creates all kinds of problems. And if you have 1 acre of land, or maybe let's make it smaller. Let's say a 1/4 acre of land. That's not a very big space. A 1/4 acre of land, and one person wants to use it to grow crops. One person wants to use it to let their cows graze. One person wants to use it because they're going to use it as a landfill. One person wants to set up a machine shop there. All of those people would be in competition for that area. Is that, or is there's enough of land, like, oh, well, you can't use, even though this land would potentially be ideal as a place to plant your crops, this guy wants to use it as machine shop, so instead he should go over there onto that mountainscape or some other area. And so that's kind of an issue for me, is how do these people determine where the best place to set up their shop is, or where to do their activity?
Well, I think again, firstly, with the idea of like just land being for everyone, land, yeah, that's the case. Like, land is for society, and society as a whole decides. So yeah, you'd have land separated for like farming and stuff. But unlike today, where you see massive farms and food resources being kept away from the public and being sort of like kept as a bastion for those who have money to pay for it, it belongs to everybody. So everyone sort of says, right, these areas are for farming. And because there's no longer the sort of poverty and wealth deprivation you see under capitalism, no one's going to be sort of like charging into the farms and be like, right, we must stay here. As for like a skyscraper being just planted onto a farm because someone says, oh, well, it's my land now, no one owns it. Again, that ignores the idea that everyone owns the land. So that person
no, not saying it's my land now. I'm saying they plant skyscraper now so that everybody can use this huge big building as an office space. But it needs to go somewhere.
I mean, what there's like, if it's already been designated by the community as a farming area.
So what? Okay, let's make it a little less extreme. Okay, farmer 1 wants to plant corn. Farmer 2 wants to plant watermelon. Farmer 3 wants to plant peanuts. Farmer 4 wants to plant wheat. Who gets to? How do you? And there's only so much area that's designated for farming land, or that is farmable in the world as a whole. There's only so many areas that are plotted out that are convenient for growing and all that sort of thing. So when it comes to that, how do you choose which resource or which crops to grow in a specific area?
I mean, like, it's the case, again, of the community deciding that there's enough land and resources in the world to have enough farm for corn.
Well, there's not always going to be. Well, I mean you say that there's enough, then why do we have to clear forests to make farmland?
Because people want more profit, and our means of production and our means of distribution under capitalism are extremely flawed. It's why, like, you see people saying we have an overpopulation problem and we've got limited resources. Yeah, at the same time, we've got a huge amount of wealth stockpiled at the top and out of circulation and just hoarded by like the 1% in a way, whilst the rest of us are sort of having to find our resources grow sparser and sparser. It's why, for instance, like, we have oil and fossil fuels and unrenewable energy sources still being used and still being spoken about as we're going to struggle to maintain these sources, even though we've known about renewable energy sources for ages. We have a system which essentially allows a few people at the top to control all elements of society. And that's not a case of, like, I'm not saying, like, oh yeah, the Illuminati or anything. We've got a system where the wealthy distort society's distribution and sort of image of itself to the point that we think we're on the verge of a crisis, and we only are because of capitalism, because we have a system that has distributed wealth so poorly that we have groups at the top with everything. What is that? Sorry, my phone just went off there.
Okay. So do you think overpopulation is a problem? Currently?
Yes and no. I mean, it shouldn't be a problem. It's not a problem, but it is a problem because of capitalism. So, for instance, if everything was distributed fairly under a better system, it would not be a problem. But at the present, it is being made a problem because we have so much concentrated wealth at the top of society, and then not enough at the obviously the rest of society. Hence, you see people saying, "Oh, but wages are being driven down by immigrants and stuff," and what other things have said, like, "Oh, Africa is just a swarm of like people just overbreeding and stuff," and all this like sort of borderline racist stuff said about like groups in society and stuff. When in reality, it's the fact that we have a groups at the top of society that own everything, and those on the bottom who own essentially nothing, and the people at the bottom are vastly out under over what am I talking about? The people at the bottom are greatly greater in number than the people on top. Sorry, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, well, that's how percentages work. That's the 1% is always going to be at the top, and the other 99% is always going to be at the bottom.
You know what I mean? Like
you can't get around that. The poorest 1% are always going to be the poorest. It doesn't matter if, like, hey, there's the poorest 1%, and then you print $5 trillion and you spread that evenly amongst everyone. Well, the same bottom 1% is still the bottom 1%. But there's something interesting that you said there. Oh man, I lost my train of thought talking about the percentages. Okay, so if everything was distributed equally, right? So there are 7-point-something billion people, soon to be 8 billion people on the planet. So let's just round it up to 8 billion. So 8 billion people on the planet, everybody gets an even portion of everything. What happens when people start having children?
Sorry?
So there's 8 billion people on the planet. Everybody gets an equal share of everything. One person has an extra kid. Now there's 8 billion and one person on the planet. What happens?
Well, I mean, firstly, you obviously you'll know 1 over 8 billion is not that much different from 1 over 8 billion and 1. But secondly, we are as a species an adaptive one, and one in which the community makes decisions as a whole. And as technology and science advances, these issues of overpopulation and over-resourcing won't happen, because instead of, for instance, the people on top trying to insulate themselves from the problems on the bottom by, like, for instance, neoliberalism, which has essentially diverted vast quantities of wealth upwards instead of essentially being put back into society more so than it already was. Instead, you have a society in which these problems are not problems because they're sort of tackled by the community as a whole. Like, you're going to see, as we already have seen throughout history, science improve and grow. And the idea of like children draining more and more resources is again one we conceptualize and have under capitalism because of our poor means of distributing wealth and resources. So hence you see people say, well, I mean, that is true. Like, you look at wealth inequality and it's colossal. Like, what is it? 50% of wealth on the planet is owned by like a handful of people. Imagine if all that wealth was distributed evenly. Suddenly you erased like some colossal problems. Even like what you said a second ago about how the top 1% will always own the top 1% or sort of something like that. Like, that's not the case though, because the top 1% own more than the bottom 99%. The idea that we have wealth inequality is something inherent to capitalism. And the system where we have equal wealth and we don't have the exploitation of labor that we see under capitalism, which I want to talk about in a second, actually, is something that like is unique to capitalism. It's just not.
Have you ever heard of Pareto distributions? Pareto?
Rings a bell. Rejog my mind.
Okay, so Pareto distributions is the idea, or it's not an idea, I guess. It's a principle that hasn't, to my knowledge, been proven incorrect. And the principle is, in any given field, 50% of the work is done by the square root of the people involved. So what this means is if you have 100 people, like say researching science, 50% of their scientific advancement would be done by 10 people out of that 100. If you have 10,000 people, it's not going to be 1,000 of those people that is doing 50% of the work. It's going to be 100 of those people doing 50% of the work. That's Pareto distribution, and that is seen in a vast amount of human interactions and in nature. It's a very interesting principle that seems to apply nearly universally. I
And
haven't seen any debunking of Pareto distribution.
but
To my
what are you
knowledge.
saying though?
So what I'm saying is, when you're talking about scientific advancements, the half of the scientific advancement is going to be done by the square root of the people doing the scientific advancements. And that is why you're seeing the 1% owning 99% of the wealth, because that 1% is the square root of the square root of the square root in all these different fields overlapping.
So I mean, I completely disagree, but you think it's justified for a small group of people to control essentially all the wealth?
No, I don't think it's justified. I think that's unavoidable.
You think it's unavoidable?
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose I would direct you to the way or sort of
Okay.
what neoliberalism has done to the world and globalization.
So
Like you look at companies like I don't know, like Nike, Adidas, these TNCs, which make vast swaths of profits, have mega like billionaires as shareholders. Some of the richest people and most powerful people in the world, essentially, are the heads of these corporations because they're so wealthy. And then you look at their actions in I don't know, Southeast Asia, on the subcontinent, where they have these massive factories where they can pay their workers next to nothing. They don't have to meet health and safety regulations. They can dump their waste wherever they want. They can essentially do what they want with barely any regulations from governments who want quick money,
okay.
essentially. And that's how they have their wealth, because, as always, it's come at the mass
So
exploitation of workers at the bottom. And in this,
so but
you
what do
suppose,
they provide? What are they producing? They're producing a lot of things, and people are buying from Nike. People are buying from these companies. That's why they're generating more wealth.
but
Like
then
me
the
in
work.
my house, if I am making shoes in my bedroom, well, Nike is making infinitely more shoes. Well, not, I mean, maybe not infinitely, but a significant, exponentially, I should say, exponentially more shoes than I could produce on my own. And they're selling exponentially more shoes than I could produce on my own. Therefore, they're getting more of the profit, even though it's in the same time frame as me working by myself. That's Pareto distribution in action.
It's
Nike
the
makes
people.
most of the money because they're doing the majority of the work.
But it's not the people who did the work who get the money. It's the shareholder in America who gets the billions, and the people in Nike got paid what, like a few pennies, essentially,
Okay.
essentially.
That,
Um, and
so
it's like the ones
so
there making the product. But the people who
what is work?
what is work?
Yeah,
Well, in the
I
case,
guess maybe that's the difference is here is your explanation of work is actually building the shoes in the factory.
what labor
Right,
hours
that
put
seems
in, essentially, isn't it?
okay.
So, for
Labor
instance,
theory of value can be good.
I mean, like you look at, for instance, to make a Nike trainer, you got the people who get the fabric, who make and mold the fabric into the shoe in factory, people who ship it across from India or Bangladesh or whatever to the American distributor, people who drive the shoe to the store, people who sell it in the store, um, and all of that process is then profited off and provided, so capitalized off by the owner who did nothing of any of that process,
Yeah.
but gets to what we did. What did they do? That process could have been done without the owner.
Okay. How did they get the materials to build the shoe? Where did those
Like,
materials come from? Were they gifted, donated to Nike?
well, they were found like what on the resources of the earth, aren't they? But again, that's not Nike's, is it?
Well, somebody took the time to dig in the earth or to
Yeah, but
grow the crops and then turn those, and then somebody bought those crops and somebody bought those raw resources,
exactly, but
made them into other resources,
not
and then
Nike
somebody else
though.
brought
It
products of
wasn't the
those and they all come together.
it wasn't the billionaire on top who did that, though, was it? It was the farmer or the miner or
Okay.
someone else.
So you're saying the people who grow the crops should be the richest people as opposed to the owners of the businesses.
Well, no, the people who do the
So
work should receive the fruits of their labor. You shouldn't see people right at the top having these luxurious, rich lives,
well,
and then people at the
well
bottom
even
who did the work are losing out, which they do.
well even under your own labor theory of value, labor or value is being added at each step. So the farmer who's raising, let's say, flaxseed or linen. What's that crop called? Let's just say flaxseed or whatever. So for textiles, so they're growing these. Oh, let's say cotton because that's much easier to understand. So they're growing cotton, and they're selling cotton. Well, their labor is the process of growing the cotton, and they sell the cotton to someone else. And when somebody takes that cotton and they put it through a loom and they get thread out of it, and then that adds value to it, and then they sell their product for the value that they added, and then someone else takes the thread and they weave it into shirts or the material for shoes, and make textiles, and then their value adds more and more onto that. So the entire process, everybody's adding value as it goes through, and then the final product is the shoe, and there's value added in each step, and that shoe is sold for a much larger profit than each individual component was producing.
However,
so
that's why you go ahead.
I was like, so what you're saying is the people at the bottom, the first guy to get the raw materials, should earn more than the people who are selling the final product, which is the sum of all the parts. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, no, because the person who sells it in its final form, I mean, firstly, that's not even the people who are getting the billions. But secondly, without the labor of everyone else who came before them, they would not have the shoe they've got in front of them. So why is it fair for them to make loads? Or how much do Nike trainers cost? Like exceedingly amount, like what, £90, which is like what, $150?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't buy them.
Well, neither. But yeah, like the product in the West is far more than anything received at the other end. Without the farmer who even got the materials in the first place, what would the people in the West even have to sell? But then they get to live.
Each person is profiting in the chain.
No, they're not.
Each person is making more than they put in.
No, they're not. What are the farmers who are like living in essentially shanty towns getting? What are people who are living in factory accommodation getting?
So farmers are selling their products at cost or at a loss?
I mean, they're essentially like, they don't really have a say in the process. I mean, with capitalism, you have to sell your labor. You have to sell your labor, or what? You can't feed yourself. You can't live. You die, and you're essentially trapped in a set job because you're moving around and traveling. That costs money, so you can't escape this job. So you're trapped in the same low-paying rubbish job for like what, vast quantities of your life.
I get you're saying low-paying rubbish job, but they're still making money. Like they're still making a profit, are they not?
Well, no, because their money has essentially been profited off. Their labor was profited off by the company Nike. Meanwhile, they are stuck. Like their money that they got is going towards paying for food, paying for I don't know, living costs and stuff, which they are essentially trapped in because they can't leave if they want to have any money to survive. So, like for instance, in many factories across Southeast Asia, you see workers having to pay the corporation that's employing them a fee just to live in their accommodation, which is the only accommodation available because the corporation owns all the land there, or owns land like around the factory. So you've got essentially it's de facto slavery essentially, because whilst fine, they're being paid for it, but they're trapped in the jobs. They can't leave because they'll have no money and stuff. So they have to work in these low-paying, awful jobs, have to agree to have their labor profited off, and subsequently, they don't get a say in what happens at the other end, where the Nike salesman sells the thing, and the Nike shareholders get billions out of exploited labor across the entire way. Like the reality of capitalism, the reality of the wealth of people at the top is that everyone beneath them, the vast number of workers beneath those on top, they've all been exploited, all profited off to get the wealth at the summit of society.
Okay. So maybe I should ask, what exactly do you think profit is? Because if they're being exploited the way that you say, then the farmer, rather than making low wages and all that sort of thing for selling his product, those farmers, it sounds like they should be charging more. So instead of charging $1 for for a pound of their product or whatever, they should be charging like $100 because Nike's going to make billions off of it. So they might as well.
It's not their land.
Otherwise, if they don't charge the higher prices, then they're allowing themselves to be exported.
It's not their. Right? It's not. That's the whole point. Where it's not their land. The corporation gets it off them, and then employs them back, and they're essentially working on someone else's land. So they're farmers in the sense that they're literally farming the earth to produce the crop, but they're not farmers in the sense that they own the farm. They're just working on the farm as a farmer of the land. And the same with all of them. Like the person who made or the shoe in the factory doesn't own the shoe. They've just made it for the corporation they're working for and get paid a paltry wage.
Okay, so you're saying the entire process, nobody owns anything, and that's a problem.
What I'm saying is that the corporation that owns everything, the people right at the top, they control essentially the entire process and subsequently profit off the labor of others. And obviously that's unfair because their labor is not being met with a fair outcome.
So nobody sells anything to Nike. Nobody sells things to Nike.
The workers sell their labor to Nike, and they don't get the produce of their labor in return. So, for instance, imagine
how much Nike is worth. More?
They can't. No, it's not. That's the whole point. They're, like I said earlier, they're trapped. If they say no, I want more for my wage, the corporation says, all right, off you go, get someone else in, because these areas of Southeast Asia are quite densely populated. They don't have a job anymore, and they've got no money, and they starve and die. So the choice is you work for one of these corporations, Nike, Adidas. It doesn't really matter. They all pay essentially nothing, or you starve. And obviously, if you've got you're not going to let yourself starve, are you? So you accept the job with the rubbishy, unfair wages, the terrible conditions, and the process continues. There's no means to actively challenge any one of these corporations.
So, if I'm understanding this correctly, it's either starve or work for Nike.
Or one of other TNC.
Or one of these other corporations. So you're saying that is Nike exploiting these people. So imagine if, in order to remove this exploitation, Nike and all these big corporations leave. That is, they all leave tomorrow. Nobody's exploited. And that would, by your own logic, that means that everybody in that region starves. So that's what I'm not understanding is they're providing a way for these people to not starve, and you're saying that is exploitation. Because without these companies, people would starve.
Well, I mean, even if that was true, that wouldn't mean that it's not exploitation. For instance, you could be starving in a desert, and I could show up with loads of water and say, right, if you drink this water, you are now my servant forever. Yeah, fine, I've fed you and I saved you, and you agree to it. Yeah, fine, I've saved you from dying of thirst and malnutrition, but at the same time, I'm still exploiting you as my servant.
Okay,
but then you
should give them.
What you're suggesting is that in these regions of Southeast Asia and other areas where TNCs have placed their factories, that there is nothing, and they just build their factories, and there's just they're the ones controlling. That's sorry. No, that's not at all. But the land that is there, was taken by colonialists and imperialists and all the various forces over time, and eventually corporations of the West give us now their land, and then they say, right, we own this. If you want to live, essentially, you will work for us under exploitative conditions with no dissent. So there is stuff there, but it's all controlled by the corporations. So absolutely, if you scrapped all the Western corporations, if you got rid of the people who controlled the entirety of the land and the wealth, then yeah, the people who were there would be in much better situation, because all of a sudden they've got a society where they get to control their own labor, where they get to have a say in what happens, where no longer they're having to give up their lives essentially to these corporations who just employ them for nothing and get billions at the other end. And things better. So absolutely, without the corporations there, their lives would be better. And that's the case for any.
So then how? So the corporations got there in the first place through imperialism. Through they went in and conquered the people of that area through force.
I mean, somewhat. It's not a case of So obviously, it's not like Nike sailed to China, wherever, and now we're the Nike empire starts now. But certainly, if you look at areas like India, like Bangladesh, areas of Southeast Asia, the colonial forces of centuries ago, their legacy is still there. India, to a certain, the British exploited India's resources and land massively, and subsequently today, you see British companies and other companies from the West placing their factories there, exploiting the labor there, and then reaping the produce back home. That's stuff that carried over from the colonial era. So yeah, fine. Obviously, it's not exactly. It's not literally like they still plant flags down and like, yeah, we're the empire of Nike or whatever. But at the same time, like the era of colonialism has got a new name, and it's called neoliberalism, and it's at core capitalism. It's the idea of exploiting people for more profit, based seeing workers of the southeast and the other parts of the world as a commodity to be profited off, and that's literally what happens.
Okay, so I guess we should circle back to the labor theory of value. And so you say that work is labor, like physical. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be physical labor, but labor of some sort, and that's what creates value. Is that? Or do you abide by that?
Somewhat, yeah. Like, I mean, I feel I'm not as well read on these parts. I mean,
Okay.
I read Marx, but some of his stuff is
Okay. Well,
more in depth.
Have you read anyone other than Marx?
Engels.
Have you read anyone of an opposing economic perspective?
Oh, so like
Even someone like Adam Smith.
or like
Have you read
Thomas
any
Sewell.
Adam Smith?
No, I've not read
Yeah.
Thomas Smith. Adam Smith even.
Yeah, Adam Smith, Thomas Sowell,
Milton Friedman.
yeah, Milton Friedman's really good.
Has he been tried for his war crimes yet? Actually, no, he's dead, isn't he?
Friedman?
Yeah.
Yeah, Friedman died, but war crimes. All right.
Well, I mean, you got to look at his actions in Chile, haven't you? Pinochet.
Wait. Okay, I'll have to look into, or maybe you know, how did Milton Friedman get Pinochet in Chile? Like,
no, I mean, it's in like
Friedman, to the best of my knowledge, is a free market capitalist, and Pinochet was a dictator who tried to instill a communistic economic system.
Well, Pinochet was certainly not a communist. Pinochet was a fascist who, obviously, as fascism is capitalism, or uses core tenets of capitalism, Friedman used many U.S. economists, including Friedman, to sort of craft his regime. So, for instance, Chile, like many South American countries, was heading. It was essentially decapitalizing itself. It was heading towards being more left-wing, not socialism entirely, but it was giving back land to the public-owned sectors rather than being privately owned. So the US backed a coup by Pinochet in the military, gutted the government of the left-wing governors, essentially made Chile a free market paradise, and well, I say paradise, corporate hellhole, which Friedman helped to craft. So essentially, they got their free market nation, and Chile indeed is now definitely a capitalist nation, but it came through war crimes and it came through intervention. And you'll find that many nations have been crafted by the US in that way, because the US has seen an opportunity to get its corporations more wealth, to create more profit for itself, to generate more wealth. And it hasn't cared about the democracy and values of the people who were there originally and the nations that existed. They've gone in, intervened, and got capitalism as a result there.
So are you saying that Chile is worse off now than it was before?
Well, I mean, yes, pretty much. I think that politicians and people dying and being massacred to enforce capitalism is absolutely a bad thing.
Yeah,
and I don't think there's any
defense. That's
how it happened.
That is the using the ends to justify the means, which I don't abide by at all. But my question is, were they better off before that intervention than they are currently? Was it the means were terrible and the ends were terrible? Is that the case?
I would say yes. I mean, I would say, as with a lot of capitalist nations, wealth is concentrated at the summit of society, whilst those who weren't in the favorable positions to receive the affluency have not. So you still have the workers doing the work and those on top benefiting from it. I actually have a Chilean friend at the university I go to, and he says from his own experience, like, that Chile isn't a great place to live. It's very right wing. It's very sort of concentrated wealth at the top. Like, it's not good. It's sort of why America is sort of loathed by many in South America, because of their sort of history of intervening in that continent.
Okay, so you said that. So his issue with Chile was that there was a large concentration of wealth at the top. would it be better for there to be a large concentration of wealth at the top and a middle class and apparently a lower class in Chile than to have everybody equally destitute, which was what, from my understanding of the situation, is how they were before the military intervention. It was rather low economically.
It was low economically because of the previous regime. It was actually literacy rates and education rates were improving under the new left-wing reforms that had been passed. Like I said, the government was quite left-wing, which is why it was so abhorred by the US. And you look at how people were improving under the new reforms that were sort of more anti-capitalist than capitalist and moving more left. And then obviously that was at the chagrin out of the US, and subsequently the US intervened. So no, I would disagree. I would say that people were better off and would have been much better off under the pre-fascist government than the actual fascist government. I think it's actually quite gross that people can sit and defend Pinochet for a GDP growth and like economical boost that only affected those on top. And like,
how can you say it only affected those on top? This is something that I don't understand when you're talking about capitalism versus socialism. Is
for instance,
you tend to focus on the 1% when you're ignoring the statistics where poverty as a whole has been disappearing globally, like at an astonishing rate.
Well, I mean, it's not entirely true, though, is it? Because like how you qualify poverty needs to sort of be addressed. So, like, for instance, in the UK, our GDP has grown and our minimum wage has rose.
Yeah.
So people have technically got more money, but at the same time, our money is concentrated at the top. So our GDP doesn't take into account that those on the bottom do not own that much. So there's people actually increasingly are falling under poverty. There's more food banks being used. There's more public services falling into disrepair, whilst our GDP is growing and our economy is getting better. Like, our system isn't actually like reflecting the statistics and the values that we produce. So when the Conservatives say, "Oh yeah, we've improved the wealth of our system," it's a lie. Like, our system's getting worse, and our statistics.
I wasn't talking about GDP overall. I was talking about the amount of people in poverty that has decreased overall. The number of people who earn less than $1 a day has. Is it $1 a day or is it $1 a month? I can't remember, but the actual statistics, it's they base it off of $1, and we've gotten rid of, or we are what's the way to phrase this? We are ahead of schedule, I guess. That's because they wanted to cut worldwide poverty by 2020, I believe. They wanted to cut it in half. But we've already reached that, and now we're doing even more to reduce worldwide poverty as far as the metric they're using for that, which I guess I could look that up to see the exact metric there. Because I know it's something to do with $1 US, and I believe it is $1 a day of wages. So that's the metric they're using for worldwide poverty. So.
And do you think that's the cause? You're essentially saying that capitalism has caused poverty to decrease?
Yes, I would say that is capitalism working.
But like how? What do you think happened?
No, just capitalism tends to create more overall production, which production is the cornerstone of everything. It's the more you make, the more you make, the more you have to spread around. It's
so you think that the corporations, the people on top, got more wealth, and that just made the people on the bottom richer?
Well, you have to think about how they got that wealth. Like, do you hate Bill Gates? Do you think that Bill Gates should return every dime that he made? Well, I mean, do you think Bill Gates should return billions and just make just a couple 100,000?
Well, yes, as the labor was not his, was it? So, like, for instance, he had great ideas with his computers, but who made the computers? Who went into the mines and got the silicon out? Who made the computers in the factories? Who delivered the computers to America? Did Bill Gates produce that billions and the billions and billions he owns himself? No, well, it was down to the labor of others as well. And yeah, no one's saying that his ideas...
And they got compensated for that.
No, they didn't. What, you think people who died in mines in Africa actually got any compensation for
Well, the people who died didn't, but the people who lived got paid for their work.
you can't say that. The people who died didn't. That's the whole point. People just workers get tossed aside, and the people
Well, how are you
survive.
how are you supposed to compensate a dead man?
You
Is there
scrap
some kind of
capitalism.
afterlife treasury that I don't know about?
You scrap capitalism, and then you compensate everyone who's
Oh,
died under the system. Going
okay.
back to something you
Under
said a second
communism, no
ago.
one's going to have to mine for resources.
Well, automation is a great thing, and we're improving on it every day, aren't we? So, I mean, what?
Okay. How do you build the machines to automate the process without mining for resources?
Well, like you, obviously, there's going to be some people building a machine, but
Well, then
they
some people are going to die, so we've got to
no, they're
scrap
not.
capitalism. There's
If
no way
we
to
have,
avoid death by mining. It's
so no
impossible
one
to
has to go
avoid.
into a mine anymore. You don't. It's not like because
No, we don't have to. No, we
no
just
one has to
we'll just
go into
stop
a
mining
mine.
altogether, and we'll just use the resources we have right now because we don't want anybody dying
No,
in
but we
a
don't. We have
hazardous
machines.
situation.
Like we have machines to
We have to build the
man.
machines first.
Yes,
That
but building
requires
machines is
resources.
not. It's not. We have. It's not like we don't have any machines now, is it? And also, machines don't have like they're not. It's not the same amount of risk to building a machine as there is to going into some mine. Like, but going back to
That's
what you
not
said a
what I
second
said.
ago, you said that poverty was falling because of capitalism. How do you think
Yes.
workers got the improvements made to capitalism?
Okay. Because people can have a safe environment working on a farm. Just, hey, I'm going to grow crops. I don't need to go into the mine. I'm just going to sit here and grow crops, feed my family, live off my own land. That's what people were doing in the United States. In the United States, before the Industrial Revolution, 99% of the population was involved in agriculture. That means they were farming off of their own land, self-subsistence, and hunting on their property in order to feed themselves and their family. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, we went from a 99% agricultural population to less than 2% of the population producing all of the food for the United States. That meant people could stop working on farms and they could go into other areas where they earned more, where they were able to profit, which is something I would like to see you explain what you think profit actually is.
When did you say this
And
was?
because of that, they could, instead of just barely getting by and feeding their families, but they could actually improve their livelihoods over time because they could earn more money doing more dangerous jobs.
When was this, did you say? And when, like,
Prior
where?
to the Industrial Revolution.
So what, 1800s?
Yes. People left farms where it was
I mean,
nice and safe, where they could usually make a living and usually feed their families, and except for extreme weather conditions and that sort of thing. But they left that condition to work in factories where they could potentially die or severely injure themselves working under extreme conditions. Why would someone leave the farm and go to a factory or someplace where they could lose their lives in order to just make money? What's the incentive behind doing that?
Well, two things. Firstly, in cities, yeah, fine, there's more money. But if you've seen urban city areas in this time period, people were not, like, in the industrial era especially, poverty was rampant. Like, people were not living good lives. They were working in factories because, like, that was, yeah, fine, that was where you needed to be to get money. But also, the 1800s in America, you still had slavery. So you had essentially a way of getting money for free because you didn't have to pay your slaves. Like, you don't need to worry about making profit when your workforce is just slaves. So you can disregard
No,
that.
in the South it was slaves. In the North, where it was
And
industrialized,
where do you
it
think
was
the farms
labor
are?
that left the fields in order to go to factories. Slaves
Well, I
didn't
mean,
leave their plantations to go to work in factories in the North. You're conflating two different scenarios. So in the South, yes, it was predominantly agriculture, remained agriculture because slaves made it agricultural profit. For the people in the North, where they didn't have a booming slave trade, agriculture was, you were barely getting by, you were providing for your family, but it was safer than going and working in the big city in the factory. So you're saying that people gave up safety where they had everything in order to make profit, and you say that that is a bad thing, even though that allowed them to provide more for their families than they could on a farm.
I'm saying that people being exploited, but having their dangerous hours in a factory not rewarded to them, like in the form of the product they've made being given back to them, is unfair. But coming back to what I was saying ages ago, and what I was going to respond to when you said that, what was I saying? That poverty has been decreased because of capitalism. I would say
Yes.
that that is completely untrue, and that it's actually the efforts of workers to fight for themselves and to strike and to form unions that has caused things to improve, and to cause some poverty. So, for instance, in America, we'll go to the like what 1950s, for instance. You've got an entire sort of populace in black people who are still not being considered full humans. So they're still living in massive poverty. They're still in a pretty poor situation. Then along comes the Civil Rights Act, and suddenly this massive group of society has been lifted with, or there's been massive improvements made. Like obviously it's not still perfect, but there's a massive improvement. So you've got workers who are no longer sort of having rules written against them, being able to enter into these sort of statistics and sort of having their situation improving. So that's not the efforts of capitalism, that's the civil rights movement. It was capitalism that saw them as a commodity and saw people as being able to sort of just make them a unpaid sort of group. And obviously that's where a lot of the profit came from. Like you mentioned how the South used slavery, but the North didn't, but the North still trades with the South. So their profits there are still coming from slavery. America's still like
So
at this point using slavery. But um, when you end that oppression because of worker liberation, because of worker efforts, you see improvements in poverty. It's why, for instance, you see in Southeast Asia, unions and sort of workers groups are severely suppressed. They're sort of like crushed from the start because they know if they have unions, workers' rights will improve. If they have left-wing ideas, they'll suddenly start to improve their lives. And obviously, corporations can't have that because then you have less profits back in the West. So unions are severely crushed. It's
I
why
think we
any
need
good
to
fascist,
discuss what
any good
profits are.
hold on a second, any good fascist will tell you, any good right-wing capitalist will tell you that unions and strikes are immensely dangerous to your profits because they essentially act as workers gaining their class consciousness, gaining their
Okay.
awareness of themselves and saying, no, we need more for what we put in, which is why you're seeing Trump crush unions and trying to like stomp out strikes. It's why you saw Hitler. One of the first things he did was to essentially crush the unions, crush the communists, crush the left-wing people who wanted work solidarity. Any fascist will tell you that to get rid of unions and to get rid of worker solidarity and worker dissent is a massive boost for your capitalism and for your profits because workers are the ultimate drive for helping workers, not capitalism, not free market, worker solidarity. Anyway, that was a big word jargon.
Yeah.
Off you go.
No, I get your point. I disagree with you, but I think it's fundamentally on what you think profits are. So I think that's the point of contention here is you continually talk about profits as if they're a bad thing, and increasing profits is detrimental to everyone, apparently. But what is a profit? Are profits inherently bad? Is there such thing in your mind as a good profit?
Well, no, because all profit has to come at someone else's expense. How can you profit of someone else without negatively affecting them? Like for instance,
So
if you for let's say you make a car and then I sell it for more than what you made it for. So like I I'm profiting off your work. You have been negatively affected because I have more money than you as a result of me
well,
profiting
how
from
did
your
you
work.
sell my car?
Sorry?
Or you're saying you hired me to build a car for you and you sold the car.
Yeah,
Is that the scenario here? Okay.
essentially. But if you imagine like what happens in the rest of the world, it's like what 100 workers make
Okay.
X, and then
So
businessman sells X for more than what X is worth, or or they sell
well, how do
X
you know
for
it's
X,
more
and
than
then
what X is worth? If somebody paid for the X at that value, then isn't that the what it's
X,
worth?
if X is what the workers
Do
put in, the boss either sells it for more than X or
what
takes their valuation of X and
well
then gives back less than what the workers
that
put in.
that's a fundamental problem. That's what I think the difference between my perspective and yours is because you said that people sell things for more than they're worth. That doesn't make any sense because that means the boss isn't robbing the workers. The boss is robbing the people they're selling it to because the person who's buying it is overpaying for it. And the boss is collecting the difference. Because if I could buy a car for $1,000 and yet workers are being paid and the boss is like, oh no, I'm going to sell this car for $24,000, but it's only worth $1,000 and I'm going to take the difference. They're not robbing you. They're not robbing the workers. They're robbing me as the customer because I paid $23,000 more than I should have.
They're robbing you and the workers, essentially. So yeah, that's actually, I mean, that scenario is actually what happens, to be fair. I mean, you see like
because if you cut the boss out of the situation and I paid you just what the car was worth, you would only get your portion of that $1,000 rather than your portion of the $24,000.
But that's the whole point. I mean, firstly, like the $24,000 is never going to be seen by those workers. They'll be even lucky if they receive $1,000, to be honest. Like, for instance,
I get you, but you're saying that the boss is robbing the workers, which I don't see happening.
But they are. Like,
if anything, the boss is robbing the customer by the way that you structured your scenario of the way profits work. The boss isn't robbing the workers. The boss is robbing customers. I don't see how you could be robbing both at the same time.
Of course you can. Like, I mean, firstly, the so you've got two separate sessions of transactions. So the buyer from the boss with the overinflated value of the object, and the workers with the workers who made the product, and then the buyer's the boss. But the boss is obviously not having to really pay anything from the money they've then got elsewhere. Like, for instance, it does not cost. I'm trying to think.
You've never been a boss, I'm guessing. You've never been a boss. You've never hired anybody. Well, I guess maybe have you worked for anybody? Maybe I should start with that.
Yeah. Yes.
Why? Yeah. That was being exploited. Why would you work for somebody?
Well, you have to, don't you? I mean, as a student, it's a little bit different because obviously, like, I don't have to go into full-time work yet. I've got student loan and stuff. But if I was to enter the job market, if I was not a student, I was just like having to pay rent and stuff. I have to have money to survive, and no one in a capitalist economy, no place is going to be like, yes, we're going to give you exactly what you put in. We're a fair company, because that's not how profit works. Profit always has to come at the exploitation and at the expense of someone else. So I agree to have my labor hours exploited to make anything in society. And subsequently have money. It's like, for instance,
can you not self-employ in the UK?
Well, yeah, but how am I going to do that? Like, you can't just magic a company out of nowhere.
No. But do you do anything that you could sell? Could you freelance what you do? Could you say, this is what I do, hire me, like a plumber? Plumber is a freelancer. Plumber says, hey, I repair pipes, or I install, toilets, I install showers. So somebody hires them to do that job. They go out, they do the job, they get paid for that. They set their own prices. They set how much they're willing, to receive in income for what they're providing for their customers. But under your explanation of profit, that is somebody exploiting themselves. That doesn't make any sense to me.
I mean, a plumber, like, they still have to get tools. They still have to have things to make their business work. A van, a set of tools, experience, like working time. They still have constraints to do. And I think you'll find that, firstly, a lot of these like plumbers and stuff, they're not as frequent as you'd think. Like, they have to work under a larger company themselves, so they get most of the profit, and the plumber who works for them gets less. Like, you self-started businesses like just Dan's plumber thing, they're not as frequent as you perhaps.
I understand that, but you're saying that that's impossible. But in order to prevent the exploitation and to prevent profits coming at somebody else's expense, somebody could start their own business, self-employ, set their own wages for their labor, and then there's no exploitation happening in that system.
What? So if every single thing they've done in their business is their own work, but in that scenario, like, that's not going to exist under this.
Are you saying that doesn't exist?
Well,
or it's not going to exist?
Like, so for instance, like, imagine if I don't know.
Like, I don't know how things are in the UK, but that happens all over the United States.
But it doesn't, though, does it? Because imagine if I imagine if I started writing my own stories and like they were really good, and I did all my own work.
Good example, an author.
But then an author uses what? They write on a computer. That computer was bought with exploited labor elsewhere in the transaction. You can't just ignore it just because you didn't personally see it happen or you weren't personally involved. You still benefited off the labor of other people. So, for instance, imagine I write like a best-selling book and I make £1 million off it. my book would not have been able to be written or published or widespread produced without the internet, without computers. The computer and the tools used to make the computer and the wiring for the internet, that was all made elsewhere in the world. That was workers being exploited in like what, sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, who don't see any of the profits, despite the fact they were crucial to the process.
Okay, so me writing a book and having it published exploits the people who worked on the components to make the computer.
Yeah, and
like, so me making millions. So okay, let's go to J.K. Rowling. She printed Harry Potter, made millions. Became a billionaire off of that.
Yeah.
Her billions are all the result of exploiting people in Africa.
Not all, but a major.
That is where her wealth came from. It didn't come from producing a novel that people wanted to purchase. Her wealth came from exploiting people in Africa. Is that?
It was a massive part of it, because if you take away that exploitation, if you just said J.K. Rowling, right?
If she, this doesn't add up.
Like, because if you obviously we tend to ignore the sort of rest of the world a lot. We just think, oh, it's our computer. We just write away and we make our book. And I'm not saying she's not a talented writer. She obviously had some good ideas, but if you took away the labor in the other parts of the world and said, right, build your computer from scratch, do it all yourself, everything, print it, distribute it, do everything yourself, and then that's essentially J.K. Rowling owning her own labor and then controlling the fruits. No one can do that. No one can just say, oh, I will do everything in the process. So instead, what capitalism does is it moves all that stuff away to workers who essentially don't matter, and then presents itself with, oh, J.K. Rowling wrote these books and now she's done it all herself. When no, she needed the labor of other people to make it possible. Every person who is has wealth, everyone who has profit, they relied on other people's labor. It's never only yourself. So
that doesn't make any sense to me, because you're saying that people in Africa, without the production of the Harry Potter books, were generating billions. But because she wrote Harry Potter, billions were taken from the people in Africa and given and siphoned to her for writing that book.
Not necessarily.
So she didn't add anything to the process. They did all the work, and it all gets funneled up, and it ends up going to her for writing the book. But had she not written that book, those profits would have stayed in the pockets of the people working in the mines. That doesn't make any sense to me.
That's not quite what I'm saying, though. Like, I'm not saying billions will be generated, but
okay. So had she not done anything, what would have happened to that system? Had J.K. Rowling not done anything? Had she just
there's still enough people so that just one person not doing anything, like someone else to take her place. But the whole point is that
here's what not making sense to me.
But can you not see that for J.K. Rowling to make her billions, she relied on people on the other side of a transaction, the people who made the computer and the pens and drove the trucks and stuff, and essentially made her distribution of those books possible. Without them being paid nothing, or next to nothing, she would not have her billions. So how can she? How can someone say?
I kind of understand that, but okay. So let's say I write a book, I sell 1 copy. You write a book, you sell 1,000 copies. J.K. Rowling writes a book, she sells millions of copies. I did less exploitation to the people in Africa than J.K. Rowling's, and you did more than me and less than her in that scenario. That doesn't make any sense to me. That makes 0 sense whatsoever, because in my mind, my contribution is my own. So my selling 1 book, well, that's my profit, is that 1 book. And even though it relied on computers and all that sort of thing, had I not written that book, it would have been the amount of production and all of that sort of thing that's in the current economy is 0. So me writing that book and selling that 1 book adds the value of my 1 book to the overall economy.
But
so it's hey, this is where it would be had I not written this book. With my book, it's the value of this economy plus 1 book. With your book, it's the value of that economy plus 1,000 books. With J.K. Rowling, it's the value of that economy plus, plus millions of books. So if you're saying that if everybody stopped everything, we stopped all capitalism, we stopped the entire economy, Africa would have billions just by continuing to do what they do. That doesn't make any sense.
I mean, firstly, like it's not a case of having billions. It's a case of no longer do you see workers having to be exploited. No longer do you see people being pushed into poverty and being essentially in wage slavery
But
to maintain the wealth of those millions of miles away. Not millions, millions, thousands of miles away. But what you were saying about the book, yeah, fine. Obviously, your idea is your own, but the tools you've used to create that idea and to make a book out of it were essentially produced using the exploitation of workers. And you can't divorce yourself from the fact that like our lives here in the West and anyone with any sort of substantial like wealth, their sort of way of life is produced by the exploitation of others. And yeah, it's not nice to think about because like yeah, obviously we haven't agreed to exploit people, but for us to be having this communication, people had to go and like mine stuff in Africa to get silicon for pennies. People had to navigate a ship across the Atlantic for nothing essentially. So workers across the globe doing the work to make the Western life possible for very little of what corporations at the top get.
See, that's what I think the fundamental problem here is. So okay, so we still haven't arrived at a good definition for profit, at least not in my mind. But it seems like you're saying next to nothing compared to what they would have. Like I'm saying they've got more than what they could have had they had actually nothing. You're saying next to nothing compared to what the people at the top are making. See, that doesn't make sense to me. But again, maybe I think we're operating on different definitions of profit here.
I mean, even if we are, like, I mean, I think, yeah, to be fair,
So,
like my definition.
Could you define profit for me the way that you're using it, because it doesn't make sense given what you've been discussing.
So if X workers make X, so if 10 workers make X, X is a value, and then the what's it called? The boss buys that X for less than what X is worth. So let's say like I don't know 0.5x the boss.
So profit cannot exist without a boss.
Capitalism profit can't exist in a fair system. So yeah, a boss, someone who is paying the workers to work for them and then profiting off them, that is profit, and that is obviously unfair because you're being paid less than what you put in. Like imagine, right? If you imagine a situation.
So that's your definition of profit.
Well, I mean, I think that we're sort of getting. I can't explain it fully. I'm trying to word it the best I can, but I feel like we're getting stuck on technicalities when there is like we both know what profit is.
I think your definition of profit is not the usual definition of profit,
well,
and it's
your view of what profit is?
A completely erroneous definition of profit from my understanding. So my definition of profit is getting more out of a system than you put in. That is profit. Ending up with more than you started with. That is profit.
Is that fair?
What do you mean, is that fair?
So if the people who did the work at the other end suffer.
No. You're always saying that there's work at the other end. There isn't always work at the other end.
Of course there is. No. Oh, so you think there's a scenario in which someone could just say,
there's
right,
a scenario where I can do it all myself and then sell something and make a profit.
Like what item can you do that with?
Okay, so let's see. Okay, something. Well, it's a little difficult for me in my perspective, but I do know people who handcraft chairs. Right? They go out to the woods, they cut down trees, they sand it down, they put the pieces together, and they make artisan chairs, and they sell them at craft fairs. Now, who are they exploiting in that process? Because these are public. As far as I know, they get the wood from public areas. So they go out and they find either discarded wood or wood like, hey, this is a nice tree sort of thing. They cut down their own stuff. They put together their chairs themselves, and then they sell it at market.
What about the
I'm not sure what you mean by how they are exploiting people in those situations. At least that to be a profit, but your version of profit would not apply to them.
The saws they're using, the like axes and the tools they're using to carve the wood into chairs. So yeah, maybe they've got the tree.
So they need to make their own tools in order for it to not be exploitation.
Well, I mean, if they've got the tools from like some other like factory or something, then yeah, they've taken part in the process. I mean, yeah, fine, the words maybe didn't come from anyone else but themselves, but they still
Okay,
use
so have
tools
you?
from somewhere else.
So there's channels on YouTube where it's called the primitive tools or primitive technology and that sort of thing, where it's somebody going out into the wilderness. They have no extra gear on themselves. They're just the clothes on their back, and I guess maybe that's exploitation because they're wearing clothes. But they take rocks and stuff and they start hammering away. They start breaking down woods and stuff that's in the environment around them, and they make houses out of this stuff. They make their own bricks. They make their own fires, and it's kind of teaching people like, hey, these are things that were done in order to get us where we are. They're talking about like Stone Age technology. In which case, I guess you would say the camera is exploitation and the clothes that they're wearing in the videos is exploitation, and they should be doing this in the nude in order to not exploit anybody. Is that my
okay, fine, yeah, that would not be exploitation because that's entirely their own. But that's not at all efficient, and that would, I imagine, like someone saying, "Oh, my new business idea is to like venture off into like caves." But
in that situation, building the house, in my mind, is a profit because they started off with no house and they ended up with a house. But you would say that that is not profit because there's no boss involved and nobody was exploited.
No, that's not profit because they put in their hours and they got the product of their hours. Their labor has been rewarded with the fruit of their labor, so there's no profit there. Like,
well, the profit is they don't have to build a house every day. They never have to build another shelter.
But they put in the hours to get the house. So there's no profit there. But can you see, for instance, like you would never, like neither of us would ever venture off into the woods to do this like bare earth thing. I mean, maybe you would.
Why
maybe
not?
It's like a hobby.
Yeah, but, I mean, I'm prior military. I never did the SEER training, but it's definitely something that I would like to try one day. SEER training is where they drop you out in the middle of a two acre field or 2 acre woods. You get a compass and a set of matches, and you're supposed to survive for 2 days on your own. That sounds pretty awesome to me. But
okay, well, that's
But then again, that would be exploitation because there had to be an airplane and a parachute and my knife and my matches that were not made.
That's not a jobber, is it? Like you're not like actively doing that to try and make money. But what I mean is that like for a business like or for a job,
you keep associating profit with money. Profit is not always money. Sometimes profit is a more efficient system. Sometimes profit is, I used to take 12 hours to do X. Now I take 10 hours to do X. I just made a 2-hour profit because I found a better way of doing it.
In the context
that in my mind, in my definition, is profit. You would say that that's not a profit.
I mean, not really, no, because like you've not. I mean, yeah, fine. You've made your like work more efficient. You've done something more efficiently, but profit as such, like what you haven't put in something and then gained more from it.
Well, like I used to spend 12 hours a day doing X. Now I only spend 10 hours a day doing X. Now I get 2 extra hours a day from here on out. But I need to find more things that I could do to reduce the time it takes for me to do stuff. That's in my mind, that's a 2-hour a day profit. That's profit.
But the verb you would use, would you say profit? Like I would say like, oh, I've made my time more efficient. I spent my time more efficiently. I've used my time in a better manner to have more time at the end. But that's not as such profit as such. But
that is profit. Profit is seeking efficiency. It's whether you make something cheaper because you made the process better in order to make it, or whether you found some way to make it worth more to other people. Both of those things is how you create profit. Reducing the amount of resources it takes to create something, or creating more value in what you are creating. Both of those are ways of profiting. Reducing the amount of resources, well, hours are a resource. That is profit. And that is something I do in my job because I'm a computer programmer by trade, and my entire job is built around saving people time in what they're doing on a daily basis. And that's why I make a lot of money, because I take processes that used to take weeks to complete, automate them through computing. And now instead of somebody spending their entire week or an entire employee dedicated to one task, that it's now a 2-hour long task, or somebody just hits this button on a machine and hey, now it runs by itself and they don't have to dedicate worker hours to that. That is a benefit to the company, and it doesn't exploit anybody in the company because we're reducing their workload. So I don't
But
understand how you
that's
can say
still
that is exploitation.
like, yeah, maybe exclusively on your end, like you're helping the customer and the customer satisfied with their new hours saved, then pays you in return. Like, yeah, fine, maybe in that specific thing. But then if you ignore the entire process before that, which made this possible, it's like, for instance, imagine if you built something, and you got basically nothing for it. And then later on, you see someone saying, "Oh, look, I can do this with your product," and it's all happy at this end. You were thinking, "Well, no, what about me? I did some work here too. Why aren't I being like involved in the rewards of this?" And that's on a much larger scale, obviously. The same thing that happens with capitalism and the rest of the world, and
Okay,
even within our nations. Like we see workers doing the work and then receiving none of the benefits.
but okay, you say none of the benefits, but then you were saying earlier that they do get paid for what they do.
Oh yeah, but like
What I'm
paltry
what I'm
wage.
not understanding is, so you're saying that the entire system that currently exists, because it exists, I can't do anything without exploiting someone else. So even if I go into something and I take a process that and I reduce the amount of time it takes by 1 hour. That's what I spent my time making sure that this process. I shaved an entire hour off of the process. Doing that because it's in a system that existed prior to me doing anything is exploiting the people who are mining for the resources for the computing and all that sort of stuff that existed prior to me doing anything. I don't see how that could possibly be an exploitation on my end if I'm going in and I saved somebody an hour of their time.
Because
But you're saying because it's based on a system that was there prior to me even being born. Well, actually, maybe not prior to me being born. I was born in '85, so computers were computing. I can't say exactly when the computer became mainstream and that sort of thing, but so I guess it wasn't prior to me being born, but before I had any influence on the actual market itself, this entire structure, no matter what I do throughout my entire life, I cannot avoid exploiting someone based on what existed before I entered the market. That seems ridiculous to me.
but it's
That
true. Like
the only
all
way for me to
consumption.
not exploit someone is to go and live on my own. But even by your standards, I can't even go off and live on my own
But
because that would
exactly,
be
like,
exploiting someone by preventing them from living in my house or living in my
well,
area that I'm using to farm and sustain myself.
well, you said it. All consumption, all products, all resources under capitalism, it all involves exploitation. That's sort of the whole point that
But that's your
anti-capitalists
case.
have.
That is your scenario. I don't hold that scenario. I'm trying to in your world, in your worldview, there's no way to not exploit anybody.
Under capitalism, yeah. But the whole
No,
point of
under any system, there's no way to prevent exploiting someone.
well, no, because under other systems, you don't
But
profit off other people's labor. People receive what they get. People receive what they put in. There's no longer a system in which people like on the top with more wealth can just say, right, you're working for me or you're going to starve. You're going to work and then you're not going to see any of the produce because if you
okay,
don't, then you wouldn't have any means of
well,
living.
in my case, my job is trying to save people time and money in what they are currently doing. So I could spend 100 hours creating a software that automates a process. Someone else could spend that same 100 hours mining diamonds. Now my process, well, and they would produce however many diamonds within that same 100 hours, and then I would produce however much code and produce the automated software within that 100 hours. Which one has a bigger impact on society? Because that guy mined diamonds, or we could say any resource, spent 100 hours generating a resource. I'm saving what I did by creating my program is I saved people hours every week from here until that they no longer need to do that process. I saved them exponentially more time and energy than someone who just generated a single resource that isn't renewable because what I created is something that is renewable. It's repeatable. It's what's the word I'm looking? It's compounding. It gets the more time goes by after I've created my automated process, the more benefit it adds. Like the first day, 1 extra hour. The second day, it's 2 extra hours. Third day, it's 3 extra hours. Fourth day, it keeps adding how much time was saved. Whereas and then in 100 days from now, I've saved that company 100 hours. But that same person who was mining the diamonds 100 days after they mined their original 100-hour, diamond mine or any other resource generation, the next 100 days don't add anything. The next 100, the next 1,000 days don't add anything on top of what they originally produced. So by saying that I cannot profit off of the 100, if I have an equal value to the person who's generating a resource, that's kind of robbing me of what I actually benefited the society as a whole, at least in my mind.
But
if I'm the same as somebody who mined diamonds, that to me is an injustice.
But that's not the case, though, is it? Because you're without the person who mined the resources to make the computer, your sort of function would not even exist, though, would it? Like, I mean, because where's the computer coming from? Like, if the person hasn't mined the tools, if there's no, it's like from A you go to B to go to C, but if you don't do A, how are you going to go to B or C? It's like for all, I mean, yeah, fine, you've made your part of society more efficient with your coding and stuff. But at the same time, without the person who mined the diamonds, your computer would not exist. So yeah, fine. Their interaction with it all stops after they've mined the
before I did anything.
But
it was here when I got here.
But like when you purchased the computer, the transaction you did, it ignores the.
I am responsible for what everyone who came before me did. That's what I'm hearing of your explanation. Like I am. It's my fault. Everything that happened prior to me showing up and doing anything, I'm held accountable for it. Even though I didn't build the computer, I didn't do the company that exploits workers. Even though I'm not actively doing something that is exploitation, I'm still held accountable for exploitation.
Everyone who consumes is participating in it, and whilst I'm not saying you personally are to blame, but everyone is.
The only way to avoid that, from what I can understand, is just kill all humans, and then nobody gets exploited.
Or a better way would be to remove the system that has the exploitation and move to a better one.
That's what I was just explaining with my 10-hour or 100 hours and 100 hours. We're both doing 100 hours worth of work. My 100 hours produces way more than his 100 hours. But you're saying it's the same. That's what I was trying to get at with my example. It's like,
without their 100 hours, you can't even produce your 100 hours in the first place.
Well, no. Okay, they spent 100 hours, and that allowed me to spend my 100 hours. Their 100 hours has a one-time benefit. My 100 hours benefits every day from as soon as I'm done with it.
That's not
every day benefit to my labor.
Every time,
what is the?
Every time someone benefits of your labor, they've also benefited of the person who made the diamonds because they did not have to use their labor in the diamond mine.
But it's a one-time versus an ongoing. It's called residual income.
Every time you use that computer, you benefit off their labor because you're still using it. I don't see how you can say, "Oh, my labor is infinitely benefiting them," but then their labor isn't, because your computer was made by them. Every time you use it, their labor has contributed to your benefit. And to divorce yourself from the back end, the front end, sorry, can't speak. To divorce yourself of the end, where they mine resources to make the computer, is silly.
So. But you're saying that I'm also exploiting the people who made my food, which my food I have to keep purchasing every day. They are not renewable. They're not consistent resources like, say, a computer. Okay, I will give you that mining for materials. Yes, it produces the computer, and the computer has a lifetime of use. It has, it's, until it crashes and becomes obsolete or whatever. It still has. I can keep using that computer, and as long as the computer's functional, I'm profiting off of the labor of the people who mined its components. But food, I can't understand how you can say that the same thing would apply to a situation like that. Food I eat, I get the energy out of it, I do whatever I did with the food, and then it's gone and I need to go and buy new food. It has a limited use is what the point I'm trying to elaborate upon here. Is certain professions generate limited resources that do not last over time.
But the thing is, to get the food, someone had to farm it, someone had to grow it, someone had to ship it
Yeah.
to our countries, because obviously we can't grow all the food we eat in
Yeah.
our own countries.
Yeah.
And all that labor is obviously
Is the same
exploited to
as
make a
someone who
profit.
produces something that lasts.
Well, it's still labor that's been exploited. That's the whole point. Like every
No.
transaction.
I'm saying under your communist system. I'm saying ignore capitalism for a second. Under communism,
Why are we ignoring
they're producing
capitalism?
food. We're ignoring capitalism because I'm saying how can you avoid exploiting someone? I'm trying to get at the concept there. So imagine global communism. Everything's working according to your system.
Mm.
People are generating food. Food has a shelf life. Food goes bad. Food, you eat it, it gives you a certain amount of energy, and that's it. You use that energy, and it's not like I can eat a piece of bread today and then live forever and not ever have to eat anything else ever again. It's a limited resource. You are saying that producing that limited resource has the same value as producing something that will remain, like somebody builds a let's see, I'm trying to think of something that can. So you're saying somebody creating like a loaf of bread has the same value as someone creating a bridge across an ocean or across a river that will last for hundreds of years. You are saying those two things are equivalent because of how much time and effort is put into them. And you are saying that those two things are equivalent to someone who produces something that saves people time and energy exponentially, is still the same as someone creating a loaf of bread. It's still the same as someone who made a bridge. That doesn't make any sense to me.
I mean, for a start, like bread. I mean, it's easy to say, oh, it's only a loaf of bread compared to a bridge or a computer program, but food, for one, is it's an important part of life. I mean, if you don't have food, how are we going to have the energy to even build a bridge or to think about computers? Like, food is crucial. Consumption of goods for nutrients and stuff. That's stuff that humanity has needed for its entire existence, and the fact we've been able to do it in faster, more efficient ways has been sort of a massive part of why humanity has moved forward in other departments like science and transportation.
Okay.
So, for
So
instance,
the people who made the machines that made food easier to produce, they did this. They have the same value as the people who made the food. That's what you're saying. That's what I'm trying to get at.
well, I mean, I don't know what I'm trying to understand what you're saying. Like with
under communism, the people who made it easier for us to have more food have the same value in communism as the people who make the food without doing anything extra. They don't improve the process. They don't change anything. They just follow orders. They have the same. Hey, this is the recipe for bread. Going to bake this bread day after day after day. They have the same value under communism as somebody who says, hey, let's change the recipe for bread, and this way you'll save this bread will bake faster. It'll save you resources. The people who do that have the same value as the people who do the day-to-day drone. That doesn't make any sense to me.
I mean, if you can say that, oh, the person who made the recipe is more important, but the workers who are making the bread are the ones who are still making the bread. It's like, but all you can say, yeah, fine, well, they're more valuable. But then what if the workers say, no, we're going to stop? Then the person who suddenly your whole bread thing comes crashing down because like there's no one making anything. Every worker has value, and everyone who contributes.
I'm not saying they don't have value. I'm saying there are differences in value.
But why?
But communism doesn't account for that. Communism doesn't account for differences in value.
There's differences in like what things are, but without one cog, the machine falls apart. It's like with I mean, another point is that automation is making a lot of things much.
You're saying that you're saying that the workers have a value or they have nothing, right? They either have an equal value to somebody who is changing things and improving the process. They either have an equal value to that person or they have zero value. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying they okay, let's use a scale of 10. The worker who's just following orders isn't thinking, they're just, hammering away. They're doing whatever. They're doing manual labor it can be easily replaced by any other person. Their value is 1. Somebody who's not replaceable because they're continually improving processes, making it easier for all of these people who have a value of 1 to do their job. That person has a value of 10. You're saying, nope, under communism, everybody should be at 1. So that doesn't make any sense to me.
If the people who were at 1 just like disappeared, what would people at 10 do? Like that, suddenly their entire process is gone. The people at 1 are important because they still contribute to.
I'm not saying they're not important. They still have a value of 1.
So why should they be less
the value
valuable?
isn't
Even though
0.
they're
You're
just as
saying they either
important?
have a value of 10. Everybody has a value of 10, or they have a value of 0. That's you're ignoring.
What happens if the people who are doing the work, who are putting their manual labourers at hand to make the bread and stuff, if they go, what's going to happen to the system?
Okay.
It doesn't matter how many good ideas you have.
Okay.
The crucial cog has been taken out. Like,
so let's give you a scenario, and this is a scenario that I've brought up to other communists. That there's several things about communism that don't make sense given this scenario. All right, so I have a garage. It's part of my house. Under communism, that should be my personal property. My house should be my personal property because I'm using it. I set up a workshop in that garage, and I start building chairs. This is not something I currently do, but it's something I could do. So I start building chairs, and then I start selling those chairs. Well, either exchanging those chairs for the woods to make more chairs, or or maybe even making a profit. Like, hey, it took me 5 pieces of lumber to make this chair. I'll trade you this chair for 6 pieces of lumber. So that sort of thing. So that way I can, over time I can make more and more chairs and not have to get more resources for myself. Because if I just give away the chair, well, then I'm out of chair and I've got no way to generate a new one. So anyway, eventually I've got more demand for chairs than I have time to make them. So I go to my neighbor and I say, hey, if you help me make these chairs, I'll show you how. I'll give you the resources, the 5 pieces of lumber per chair. This is how you do it. I'm providing all this stuff. You get, for every 1 chair that you make for me, I will make sure that you get some of the wood, so that way you can go and make your own chairs and you can start getting, selling chairs for your business. Eventually, right, all that is my personal property, right? Well, I just started exploiting my neighbor according to communism. All of that is in my own personal property. If I ever tried to leave my garage and say, okay, I need there's so much demand for my chairs, I need to go out to my yard, and I start, setting up a workshop in my yard. Well, then according to communism, that's the point where it becomes private property, right? And then it's owned by the workers. And so even though it's my materials, my land, it's now a business, and so therefore I don't get any of the profits of that, and it's just I did nothing to start it, according to communism. And so this is a scenario that doesn't make any sense to me. At which point in that process did it stop being my personal property and it started being private property? And at which point does my importance in the process become the same as everybody else in the process, even though without me, the entire scenario that I set up would not have occurred? Everything would have been exactly the same had I not started making chairs and selling them out of my garage.
I mean, firstly, you cut wood from the trees, and obviously, as the land, like natural land, is owned by everyone, owned by society, that is the produce of society and a factor of society. Therefore, society had a part in making your chairs in the first place. I mean, you can face
except there would have been trees had I not done anything. They would have stayed trees.
No, but the wood is still the product.
People would have to sit on the trees, so I made trees into chairs.
But the trees belong to everyone. That's the point.
Well, then I don't need. So I shouldn't make chairs out of trees because they belong to everyone, and that there's no difference between it being a tree or me turning into a chair.
No, but what I'm saying is
net neutral.
The material is still belonging to everyone. So if you just say, oh well, I made this chair, you're ignoring the fact that you use materials that belong to everyone. But you said you use the neighbor to help you make these chairs. Yeah.
I say, hey, you help me make these chairs, you get some of the profits.
But do they get an equal share? Because their labor has been put into helping you. Yeah.
Why would they get an equal share?
Well, because they're putting in or it depends how much labor are they putting in?
They're putting as much labor as I am to make the chairs, but they wouldn't have the opportunity to make the chairs and make profit off of it if I didn't start making chairs.
Why? That they can do it as well.
They could just start their own and do it the same way I did. Nothing's stopping them.
If they're working with you,
I have demand for my chairs. I built up the demand for my business.
No, but if you're
right now, nobody's at my neighbor's door knocking on there saying, hey, could you build me a chair?
Yes, but if you're asking them for help, then they can agree.
But I'm not allowed to do that under communism. I'm not allowed to do that. I just have to be. No, they can't. They can't.
That's not what anyone said. All it's saying is you can't profit off your neighbor who's working for you. Like, it's because their labor is being used by you to help. So like, you can't profit off them. You can still use
So
them.
under communism, I'm only able to keep producing chairs and then selling them at the same cost for me to produce them. I cannot make a single profit. So I need to make a chair for cost me 5 pieces of lumber, and then I trade that chair for 5 pieces of lumber, make a chair, 5 pieces of lumber, and then keep this process up. That's what I have to do under communism, according if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly.
Why would you?
Because I cannot profit.
Why would you need to profit? Where's the need for profit? Under capitalism, it's not. It's like.
Well, then why should I make a chair to begin with?
So is money the only reason you'd do anything?
What is the? Why would I like? Hey, I could just go in my garage, make my own, take 5 pieces of lumber, make a chair. I have my chair, and I can just make sure that I keep it and don't give it to anybody else. That's the incentive.
You still like
the incentive of making a chair and then giving it to other people is the ability to make more chairs, and eventually get to the point where I have more than I started with. That's the purpose. Otherwise, I would just have my chair. Like, I don't understand why I would just like, oh, I'm going to spend hours and hours in my garage away from my family making chairs just so other people can have chairs.
So you wouldn't do anything that didn't benefit you at the negative of others?
Well, no.
Anywhere away from money.
Okay. Right, because I said away from my family. Because every time I do something, I sacrifice something else that I could have done instead. So when I go out and I build a chair for my neighbors, that's time that I could have spent on myself. I could have spent with other people. But instead, you're saying that I should want to spend my time away from the people I love and care about.
That's not what
building chairs for the people who are just there.
But no one's making you build the chairs. Like, you don't have to.
No. Under capitalism, I have an incentive to build chairs. Under communism, I don't.
No, but under capitalism, if your job was building chairs, you have to build those chairs. Otherwise, you don't have money to survive and you starve. Under communism,
you have to work, otherwise you starve too. You can't use that as an excuse against capitalism and then say, oh, but under communism, nobody has to work.
But no, it's not nobody has to work, but automation.
That's what you were implying by saying you have to work under capitalism or starve.
No, because
you have to work under capitalism or you starve. You have to work under communism or you starve. You have to work under mercantilism or you starve. You have to work under feudalism or you starve. Name me a system where you don't have to work, where you can still eat.
A system like communism, where we don't need labor as much. We're coming to an age where automation, machines.
Okay, that is. If we all switch to communism right now, we're not talking about in the future. In the future, yes, eventually communism will be inevitable.
Automation is already happening?
No, it will be inevitable if I don't have to work to eat. If resources are unlimited, communism will occur naturally. You don't have to force it. If you get to the point where people don't have to work and can have food and can have whatever they want, then you don't need capitalism. Right now, is there a system where you don't have to work to eat? If we switched from capitalism to another system with what we have currently, can I avoid working and still eat? You can't use the what will eventually be in communism, because what will eventually be in capitalism, I could say, is even better. Not only will I not have to work, but I'll have under capitalism, not only will I not have to work, but I'll have more yachts than I can count.
But
and I won't ever use them because I'll have them all. I'll just have mansions upon mansions under capitalism eventually.
No, but the whole point is that with capitalism, you have to sell your labor hours to
start off with.
No, forever. Do you think that people
not forever? Okay, so you are still in school, so maybe you don't understand this. Okay, I've been in all three. Well, there's technically 4 divisions of the economy. All right, so there's the absolute poor, destitute. So I have been there. I've been at net zero. I've had $0 in my pocket, living on my own, living out of my. Well, I guess technically I had a car, so I was still the 1%. So I had a car, I had no job, had no money, had no place to live. I was living out of my car. So that was when I was 18. I had a job. I worked at Papa John's. I worked at Target. So I was manual labor from my 18 till I was 20. At age 20, I joined the armed services. I became a member of the U.S. military, the United States Air Force. I started working blue collar job. Right. After I left the Air Force, I started working for myself, doing what's this? What's that thing? I'm trying to think of the self-employed, but I'm doing contracting work. There's another word for this, but it's escaping my mind. So now I'm working for myself while making money, because I'm taking contract jobs where I'm not hired on permanently, and I only take the jobs that I want to do, and I get paid. So I'm self-employed at the moment. I'm also creating my own business, so eventually I will be an entrepreneur, hiring other people to do work for me. So I am working my way up. Right now, I don't have to work ever again if I don't want to, because I'm making money off of my houses. I'm making money off of my Bitcoin miners. I'm making money off of my existing businesses where I built things for people and they're paying me residual income. I have several revenue streams where if I don't ever want to work again in my life, I don't have to. I work right now because that's not enough. I don't want to, because right now I could stop working, but if something happens to my health, well, I don't have the money to pay for my expenses. If something catastrophic happens to me, I won't have the income for that. So that's why I am working right now to build myself a safety net, which is what I'm trying to build my own business. So eventually I will get to the point where I don't have to work, and also I don't have to worry about emergency situations. But now I've built myself up from zero. So you can't say that you have to work your entire life, and that's the fate of everyone. And this is something, if you read Thomas Sowell, you will see this. The older people get, the more money they make, the less they rely on manual labor. And the
older people lived in a pre-neoliberal time, didn't they? Firstly, but secondly, you just said that you're still working because you don't want to be like in an emergency situation. You don't want to be like suddenly.
Yeah, but I don't have to work if I don't want to right now. I can still eat, and I do nothing.
Like you can't stop working yet, because if something did happen, you'd be ruined.
Yeah,
but how long is yet going to go on for? You can't stop. You don't know when you're going to stop, because you've got
I will stop when I become a millionaire. So current projections, by the time I'm 35, I will stop working.
And how soon is that? Like, you don't have.
That's 2.5 years from now. I will be 35 and I can stop working.
And do you think that's like a realistic situation for most people?
Oh yeah. I am actually ahead of schedule. I don't know about for most people, but definitely for me, because I planned for that.
Exactly. You got lucky.
Because I planned my life out. Oh no, nobody else can plan except for me.
But like, there's still like it's not the case for most people. Like this scenario where you've just got all these things. Like you had a car, you said. Not like, I mean, yeah, fine. That's not loads, but that's more than what some people have. That's like,
I had a car and $0 in my wallet. I couldn't even buy gas to put in my car. I was living in my car.
And you had like no parents or anything, or like no.
No, I moved out of my house. No.
Well, exactly. You got raised though, yeah, and you had like a decent upbringing, or. Yeah, like a decent.
Oh, okay. So now I'm exploiting my parents. I see.
I didn't say that. But
because they were there before I got there. So anything that they did, I'm profiting off of.
Were your parents like quite poor? Did you come from like a poor upbringing?
Yes. My parents were incredibly poor. Like we lived in basically the slums of Junction City, and I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back at it now, yeah, we were incredibly poor. Like, because I remember, days where we would all crowd around our one heater because it was so cold, but we didn't have any other heat in the house, and so we're all standing on this one heat plate. That is not middle class. That is not upper class. That is poor. That is what poor people do. I remember, eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for dinner as a family. So, I mean, I don't know what your idea of poor. I mean, I guess because our family or my mom and dad could put food on the table,
No, no,
that
I'm
that
not
makes
saying you
us
weren't poor.
the 1% compared to the rest of
No,
the world.
no,
But
I'm
in the
not.
United States, we were poor.
There's
My
no need
dad
to sort
started
of.
his own business and became the middle class.
I'm not trying to say that, like, I'm not trying to, like, I don't know, denigrate anything that you have that happened to you and stuff. But I'm trying to make you see that sort of like the transactions and consumption and just the way capitalism like sort of operates, it's unavoidable to come across exploitation and stuff. And what you were saying,
It's,
the like
people
the idea of just having
improve.
these successful revenue streams and still not being able to like retire yet because if things go south, then you're going to be in ruin.
Well,
That
that's because
shouldn't
I've got
happen.
2 houses. If I didn't have 2 houses, then I could retire right now.
Well, do you think people have a realistic option of buying 2 houses?
Well, I did. I
Yeah,
went
but
from
you're
zero.
one person. You're one
Yeah, I went
person.
from zero to owning 2 houses. If I can do it, anybody else can do it. I don't
Do you
know.
not think there's like I'm not saying you're not like not worthy of him, but do you not think there's a bit of luck involved as well? Like
No,
you don't think there's any luck? Like so let's say you got injured before like now, let's say that emergency thing you were talking about, let's say that happened before now.
happened before I got to my current position. Yeah, that could have happened.
Exactly.
So
So
I guess maybe there's the luck of that. But how many people will go to the point where they're 80 and they've never had a catastrophic health problem? It's
well that's not
you act like I am lucky, like lightning struck me, like I might as well have won the lottery because I didn't get injured to the point where I couldn't
most
work.
people don't become millionaires from nothing at 18. Poverty is a pretty hard thing to get out of. It's a bit like,
Because people don't know better.
oh, well, that's just a bit silly, isn't it? Like people
No,
aren't able to.
no, no. Okay, everybody. When I was 18, I started learning about economics in the form of life insurance and investing in my future. All right. So
Like a
this is
course,
part of how I got out of my rut.
a course.
So after I got my job, my crap job working in the stock room of Target and being a waiter at Soup and Salad, earning $2.15 an hour, with tips that never came because everybody there was cheap as shit. Oh, sorry, I don't know about the swearing on your channel. Sorry
No,
about
it's
that.
fine. It's fine. It's fine. I've heard worse.
So yeah, so everybody there is. I'm earning $2.15 an hour in the United States, and this was 2004. 2003, 2004. It's legal when you're a waiter because they expect you to make tips.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Nobody at Super Salad paid any people there barely paid their bills, let alone paid tips. So I was anything that so what I did in that situation is I bought the bare minimum for food. Anything that I didn't spend on food, I invested into my retirement accounts. And I was telling everybody else at the same age exactly what they needed to do. Exactly, hey, this is what I've been looking at. This is what you need to do. You need to invest into your retirement, your Roth IRA and an IRA account. $25 a month, starting at age 18. By the time you go to actually retire, you will have millions in that account, and it's going to be way better for you than doing anything else when you're 18. So I was telling all my friends and family that. You know how many people took me up on that advice? 0. But it was because of my investment into that sort of thing. My looking at those economic things that I could do when I was 18 with $25 a month. That is nothing.
So
that is
you don't
significant.
like
Doing
firstly,
things like that got me to where I am right now.
but can you not see there's a bit of like there's more to it than just oh I put money here and I was a millionaire a few years later. Like 25 dollars
$25
in
a month is
2004 is worth like $24 is not worth the same thing. Inflation is a thing for one. So that same
people can still do that now. If you're 18 and you start investing $25 a month into your Roth IRA, you will have way more money. You will have at least something to project for. So that was step number 1, is planning for the future, right? You can do other things. So $25 a month, yeah, you're just like, oh, that's nothing. That still works today. That's that method of getting a retirement. So that was my plan, is like by the time I think it was 69 is the age at which you can actually withdraw from your Roth IRA. Because I invested in that, by the time I'm 69, I can definitely retire and lived comfortably.
Well, that's ridiculous, though.
69 is too far down the line for me. So I said, what can I do for the exact same thing at 35? And I started looking for things that I could invest in. Little bit of money, little bit of here and there. That's how I got to where I am. I started renting, renting out space in my living room, and that's where, yeah.
Well, like you said, not everyone has space in their living room. Not everyone has money aside. Like, you're saying that...
No. I was setting money aside.
No, but what if you need that money at the time? What if that emergency came up earlier? What if something happens, which is quite likely, you know, because things happen in life and you might need money for it.
Yeah.
Like this...
yes, things did happen. My cars broke down. I had extra expenses I wasn't planning on. Things in my house broke. But I was taking money and setting it aside every month for my future. And when those emergencies came, they came out of that money. If those emergencies didn't come, that money was invested into things that helped me profit later on.
But if that's
it was either my education or
if is luck, isn't it? If this happens, I will be fine. If this doesn't happen, I'm okay. It's like that's... Well, I mean, yeah, fine. Yeah, fine. You were sensible with your money, fine. That's good. But at the same...
That's the entire principle there.
But that isn't a reality for a lot of people. Like, they've sort of luck. I mean, you say you joined the army as well. I mean, I think you get a good pension for that, don't you?
No, I didn't retire from the Air Force. I did not retire. I did not retire from the Air Force.
You get a decent wage for that, don't you? Or is it not?
What do you mean a decent wage?
I say
armed forces. Yes. I made decent money.
Yeah, it pays well.
On paper, okay. So actually, what my take home was $26,000 a year. Take home. On paper, it's about $46,000 a year because there's health benefits and other stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So a lot of your sort of successful, like that comes from being in a job that pays well compared to a lot of other stuff. Like being paid in the army. Yeah, obviously there's the whole being in the army and stuff. But at the same time, you're being paid a lot better than lots of other workers. That situation is not open to lots of workers just joining the army and just like being like that. Like you can't.
Why not?
Well, because not everyone's physically able. Not everyone should be. And do you not think there's a bit of a problem where people have to join the armed forces just to be able to survive?
No, that's how I did it. I don't say that's the only way. There's plenty of other people who've done it other ways. That was my avenue because at the time that was the most bang for my buck. It was the most benefit out of my current options. So that's the one I took.
But can you not see these pathways aren't open for everyone? And
why not?
Well, because society just doesn't work like, X, Y, Z. Things happen in life which deny things. People get tired. People don't have the energy.
So people have only one option and that's all they ever get to do. And they don't have any choices.
Well, a lot of the time, their choices are severely limited. It's like, imagine, like, your environment...
Mine were limited too, and I chose the best of my options. You're saying that other people only have one option, and that's what they're stuck with.
Not one option, but one realistic option. Like, for instance, yeah, fine, maybe someone could just do this, but the scenario might be harder. Like, for instance, in the army, like, you have to pass tests. Not everyone is going to be able to pass those tests. Like... Exactly. So then what happens then? What are they going to do? Like, you can't serve in the army. Where's their 40 grand a year?
What is their next option?
Not anywhere near 40 grand, maybe. Like, you can't just say, oh, I did this, so why can't anyone else? Like, when in reality, that doesn't work.
Okay, the average income in the United States is $20,000 a year. Okay, so I had double that, so I was able to up my time frame from when my projected retirement was. Okay. So other people won't have that extra 20,000 to work with, but they can still take the 20,000 they do have and do things along the way. But so even though I was making the 46,000 a year, and that's all on paper because I actually had my take home was 26,000. So what I could actually spend and invest was closer to 6,000 on top of what other people were making.
But what I'm saying? Sorry, you finish what you're saying.
Yeah, so what I'm saying here is when I didn't have all of that, when I was making $2.15 an hour, I was setting aside money for my future, and that is what led to my current situation. Yes, I made more eventually, but I still kept the same habits when I was making more money. I set aside money every month for my future, for my investments.
And I'm sure
Even when, so, every job I've ever had, I set a portion of it aside for my future. Even when I was making next to nothing, $2.15 an hour. Really, you think that's a lot of money? Where I was just rolling in the dough and I was going out and
no, of course
partying
not,
every.
of course.
No, I was scrimping and saving. There were
That's
days where I
minimum
didn't
wage.
eat because I had. Yeah, there were days I didn't eat, even though I worked at a restaurant, because I was setting aside money for my future.
Exactly. Is that really like? Do you think people should not be able to eat, for one? For two, as in, like, do you think it's a healthy system where people don't eat in order to work? I mean, yeah, fine. You got lucky and you did well.
I'm saying it's an unhealthy mentality
to not eat.
No. To not invest in your future is an unhealthy mentality that people
So,
have.
do you think people should not eat to invest in their future?
Yes, they should sacrifice the here and now for the future.
That's ridiculous, though. Why should someone not eat?
Well, have you ever heard this? Okay, there's a study of people in children in kindergarten where they're offered one marshmallow now, or if they wait, they can get 2 marshmallows. Right? There's this, it's a famous study. And what happened is the children who were like, oh, you know what? I'm going to delay the marshmallow now for two marshmallows later. And they tracked them throughout their lives and tracked their history, what their progress was in life. The people who said, you know what? I'm going to sacrifice 1 marshmallow now for 2 marshmallows later. They had a much better life. It ended up, more stable marriages, better jobs. It's that incentive of, hey, I'm willing to sacrifice what I have now for something better in the future. People who live like that, they get to where I am.
But that's unrealistic and not equivalent.
Not unrealistic.
But no, it's not like, with that example, like a marshmallow and 2 marshmallows for kids compared to eating food and going through a day with like basic sustenance.
That's what I did.
But
I sacrificed meals back then for meals in the future that were better.
Can you not see that most people can't sacrifice like meals? Imagine if you got kids. Imagine if you're like got a lower.
Who don't have kids.
But
that's something I've said forever.
That's ridiculous. Can't
afford kids. Don't have kids. Kids are an expense.
Rich people should be able to have kids, but poor people shouldn't.
Yeah. If you can't afford them, don't buy them. Or don't not buy them. Don't. If you can't afford them, don't have them.
But that's ridiculous.
If you can't afford your new vehicle, don't get it. If you can't afford X, don't get
Why should someone born into poverty be given a worse life than someone who's born into wealth? That's ridiculous. I think that's gross.
That's the way the world is.
But that's why it's not fair.
If they want to improve their lot in life, they can't do what everybody else does. You have to sacrifice something. You can't have things without sacrifice.
Unless you're wealthy.
That's what you want.
Unless you're wealthy.
You want a world where people can have things and not sacrifice anything.
I want everyone to be able to live a life where they can eat and learn and be happy, like without having to, like, I don't know, get lucky or be born rich. And also, like, going back to what you said a second ago, like you said, the average American income, 20 grand. That is not 40 grand. And there's a reason for that, because most people can't just join the army. Most people are not going to have this, like...
You're missing the principle of sacrificing here and now for the future. Why can't people get in the army?
When you take out...
Why can't they pass those tests?
20, because, well, say if you're, like, I don't know, born with stuff, or you're educated, like, in a lower income school, or... There's so many societal factors that affect this.
If you're talking about someone who's physically unable to enter the military, that means somebody who is like, it's because maybe they were born with a genetic deformity or they have some kind of mental deformity. The other things that restrict people from joining the military service are the choices they make in life. Did they graduate high school? Do they have a criminal record? Have they been using drugs? Have they permanently scarred their body? Have they injured themselves in some way that would just, prevent them from joining the military? There's only 2 categories that would prevent somebody that are not their choice. That's if you were born with a mental defect or if you were born with some physical deformity. And that is a very small percentage of the population that qualified for either of those. Extremely small percentage of the population. I mean, everything else that would disqualify you from military service is of your own accord.
Like, I don't think you can really say that though. Like, for one, right?
No, look at the qualifications or what it takes to join the military.
Of course, yeah, but getting being a felon is not like. Have you seen the amount of people who are incarcerated in America or get charged?
Don't do the thing that gets you arrested for don't do the felony.
Being black half the time, isn't it? It's like.
Are you sure it's being black? Yeah.
No,
because okay, so you're okay. I guess this is getting off into. I'm trying to calm down here because I'm getting a little. Okay. So being black, you think is a cause
obviously not
to get sentenced,
but you could
sentenced to prison.
Police brutality against black people, the sort of the way poor people are targeted by the police because being like people who are poor tend to be greater targets of the police. Just the general, like you can't say these things like or you say passing high school, like people. The American education system is dreadful. Like there's so
I agree with you on that. The American education system is dreadful because they teach people to be workers rather than teaching people to how to think and how to be independent.
Or rather, because the public schools have no funding compared to private schools.
No. We've been giving them more and more funding every year, and every year they get worse. It's not funding issue. It's
the money doesn't go to the actual education. It goes to like what the principal or the people on top. The money disappears and gets redistributed to like schools that don't need the money. Whereas schools
even if the teacher got the extra money, would that make them a better teacher? No, they just get more money for doing what they were already doing.
Money, like
it's a terrible. No, there is no profit motive in a public school. There's no incentive to do a better job because if they do worse, they get more money. If they do better, they get more money. There's no incentive to do a better job.
But the system is broken, but not because of the like.
No, it's because of lack of profit motive.
Because no, it's the opposite of that. It's because there is the profit motive. So the schools with money do well, and the schools
look at public education versus private education.
No, but but money. Private schools have
private education has an incentive to offer a better product to teach your kids how to be.
Wealthy people go to private schools, and because they can afford it. People who have no choice where they go to school have to go to the public schools, which are poorly funded half the time. So it's
sacrifice. That's what I was saying about the
How is anyone going to afford to go to some private schools?
Okay, so this is again. Oh, this is anecdotal because it's about my personal experience. Okay, so I said my parents were not rich. My parents were extremely poor. My dad started a business on his own and worked his way up to the lower middle class. While we were in lower middle class, he sent all 5 of us to a private school. So my mom and dad worked and they sacrificed a lot. No vacations. We didn't go out to eat every night. My mom cooked and scraped, and we didn't live like we were in the Depression or anything like that, but we had to forego a lot of the nicer things in life because my parents were spending every extra cent they had to send us to private schools. That sacrifice the here and now for the better future. That's the thing that I learned from my parents.
So, and do you think it was fair for you to have to like miss out on loads of things and like have to? Yeah, why? What made
because I have a better life now because of those sacrifices.
But why? Like there are people who are wealthy who are dreadful people. Like, why are you less deserving of their like sort of nicer conditions when you were younger? Just because they happen to be born rich and you happen to be born.
Well, because those people are spoiled, and that's why they're terrible people.
No,
because they never had to sacrifice. They never had to sacrifice to get what they want.
But it doesn't matter. I mean,
you want an entire society where nobody has to sacrifice and just gets whatever they want, and you expect people to be decent people.
I don't think anyone
spoiled brat is somebody who gets everything they want.
I don't think someone should have to starve to be able to.
You want a society of spoiled brats.
Well, no, it's not spoiled brats. It's that I think lots of people are fed up.
But they want everybody to be just like the rich.
They want people to not have to starve to survive, whilst people on top like live a life of luxury built on the labor of others. But coming back to what you're saying, like all this about don't get a felony, don't do this, don't
don't get a felony. Okay, so you talked about police or people getting arrested just for being black. Well, you should take half of your issue is with the police who are doing the arresting and the justice system, which is putting them in prison. The other half of that equation is the people making the police reports, where they tell you who did the crime. Because guess who they overwhelmingly identify as the suspects when it was committed by a black person? Well, they identify a black suspect on the police report. I don't know why. They should just say, "Oh, I know the person who robbed me was black, and it's that guy over there." But I should say it's it's Humane Mind. Just just so that way
Well, no, but you're
just so that way a black person doesn't go to jail.
as there's
Look
more
at the victim
poverty.
reports. Look at the victim reports compared to the arrests.
Poverty is something that causes crime. When capitalism is poverty is
So it's,
naturally.
again, it's not their fault. It's not their fault. They were
I'm
born
not
poor.
saying it's not entirely their fault, but poverty isn't something you can help. Like if you're born into poverty, is naturally going to be more crime. And because black people statistically lived in urban areas and ghettos and stuff, and areas that are poorer, because like slavery was a few hundred years ago, the Civil Rights Act was in living memory. Like
so explain to me how slavery is holding back the black community, and yet it didn't hold back. So similar situation. I mean, granted, not slavery. But it didn't affect the Chinese. It didn't affect the Irish. It didn't affect the what's with the other group that was exploited during those times. What was the other group? So if you look at those groups now, I can't think of the other one. I want to say Native American, but that's not true. They got exploited way more than anybody else. But hey, they're doing pretty good in the casinos at least. But look at other groups that were kept back because of their race during those times. The Chinese railroad workers, yes, they were not slaves on plantations. They were effectively slaves on the railroads. I mean, I don't know if you can look back at history and say that they weren't enslaved in those conditions.
The majority.
Like you were saying there's such thing as wage slavery.
Yeah.
You think wage slavery is a thing. Well, the Chinese railroad worker, that's slavery even more so than wage slavery.
And that's how America has been built, really, off the back of slavery.
Well, look at the Chinese today.
Most Chinese Americans came after the Civil Rights Act stuff, whereas the black population was there before. And I'm not really going into the sort of like, oh, this minority did better, because I find it a little bit disingenuous.
No. Look at the groups. Look at the group, the amount of crime, the amount of success in our society. Like people talk about, oh, white, super, America is super white. Well, America's doing a really bad job of being racist and only benefiting the whites, because Asians are doing amazing in the United States.
This is often
Asians do better on every metric you could ever consider: crime rate, wealth, and marriage, stable marriages, and all that sort of thing. All of these metrics that people look at and like, oh, Asians are doing better than every other group in the United States. So I don't know how you could say it's racist against any group.
I'm fairly sure most Asian Americans and most Asians moved after the Civil Rights era, and the ones who were like there before, I'm not saying they weren't treated terribly. Like the way the Japanese were treated in America was like disgraceful.
Yeah,
but
Japanese were put in internment camps.
Like if you look at like the black, we've only had equal rights like on paper for black people in America since 60s and 50s, and even then, like studies show
10 years of difference.
Deeply broken. Well, I wouldn't. It's not
10 years of difference between the Japanese in America and the blacks in the civil rights.
The other ethnicities were more like migrating to America, whereas black people were there like anyway, like from centuries before. So the sort of areas, like for instance, in New York, you see areas like Harlem and Brooklyn and stuff, like predominantly areas with black people in, from the days of gone by when segregation was in order, and those communities, like obviously there's change now, but they've been primarily black and primarily poor because there's been little change. Because when you're poor, it's hard to get out of poverty. So
how do you account for the black people who come from Africa, like places like Ghana and what's the other one that we've got a lot of? I mean, we've been getting a lot of immigrants from these other African countries, and you look at their metrics as far as their level of income, crime rates and that sort of things. The people who are from these countries in Africa coming to the United States are better on all of these categories than the African Americans.
It takes money to move to America.
Like,
I mean,
no, these are people who sacrifice everything. Look, I don't know what you think about how much it takes to get to the United States. People who come here with next to nothing
Yeah,
When by the time they get through all the
it,
paperwork and all that, they gave up everything they had in their home country to come here, and they have next to nothing,
which is
and they
still
build a life for themselves.
it's still more than what the people
Still,
in America
than
had
the
to begin
people
with.
who live in the United States and who speak English and who go to our public education systems.
They have more
They are
money
worse
though.
off
They're
from
wealthy
Africa.
people from other countries coming to America, or well,
And
maybe
if
not
they're wealthy,
wealthy.
then why are they driving cabs? Why are they working
Yeah,
manual labor jobs?
wealthy enough to get the legal immigration status to America. But obviously, that's not the same as like being wealthy in terms of Western
But
standards and like owning a
but they
massive house and stuff. But
but they still work blue collar jobs. They're still the working class when they get here,
yes, but they
but they
still had
still
enough
do
money
better
to
on everything across the board
because
than the people who are born and raised here.
because if you're wealthy enough to legally immigrate to America in like reasonable time, you obviously had like what the because you need to know someone, you need to get signatures from people who are already here, don't you? You need like a
Yeah,
professional,
you
exactly.
need to
So you
people
need
who
to
are
be
already here. Yes, this is
you
the
need to be
family
connected.
thing.
Yeah, they can like connected or have an employer ready for you.
But
Like that's gonna take some level of like recognition
but
and
you're
stuff.
saying people who actively live here and have their entire families here and who have been here for years can't build better connections than people in a foreign country.
But when everyone they know is in the same like impoverished situation and stuff, when you're stuck in the cycle of poverty, which is pretty hard to get out of, regardless of how like your situation has been, it's
Well, you're so then how did Thomas Sowell and how did oh what's his name
Milton,
guy who just
Adams,
ran he was a candidate for president
Rand Paul.
no grew up in Harlem oh man Ben Carson wow I can't believe I blanked on the name that long Ben Carson Thomas Sowell born in Harlem raised in Harlem single parents terrible childhood now they are well known they raised themselves out of that those people could do it they show that it's possible. Now, I
Yeah,
granted those are the exceptions. Those are the exceptional individuals, and so they were. Well, look at what there's other people who have also done the same thing. Jay-Z and 50 Cent and all these rappers and athletes and all stuff. They've left the ghetto too. What makes them so special compared to the other people that live and grew up in those same areas?
well, a lot
What
of it is luck. Like it's possible to guess my number between 1 and 10,000, but you're not gonna do it, are you? Like most people won't.
so it's
Most people aren't going to guess that, but some will, and there's some who got out. Like for every Jay Z, there's
okay.
someone who could have been potentially just as good as him or better, who didn't get out because something went wrong, something unlucky happened to him, something wasn't
Luck,
quite right, which gave
luck,
Jay
luck,
Z the
luck,
same
luck.
opportunities. Like sports, another
And
one. For every athlete that
okay,
makes it to the
so
NBA,
under
another one gets
communism, luck does not
racially
exist.
profiled. Sorry.
You've eliminated luck under communism.
Well, there's no need to get lucky to be all right because no one has to suffer in the first place to begin with because there's no need for that societal poverty that ensures the top remain wealthy and the bottom have
But
to.
there's no way to get to the point where you don't have to work.
Yes, there
There's no
is.
way to. No, there's
Well,
not.
not manually, but certainly automation is removing a lot of that. And I don't know if you've seen it before. There's a nice video by CGP Grey called "Humans Need Not Apply," like sort of a brief look about how like many sectors of
Yeah,
society are moving towards
moving towards automation. Yeah, now they're getting
exactly,
rid of driving jobs through automation. I understand this. Those are all eventualities. I understand that.
and they're not that far
But
off.
but when that happens, communism will naturally occur. You don't have to force it beforehand.
But it's coming now. Like for instance, look at
So
port cities in
you're
America.
saying that that's going to happen faster if we go to communism now.
Exactly, yeah,
It's
definitely.
going to have the automation is going to happen faster
Because we have
because
everyone pulling together in society rather than just people acting in the needs for set themselves, acting for profit's sake, and sort of the world regressing in some areas. Like we're destroying our environment for the sake of profit. We're actively, well, I mean, you can shake your head, but we are like
well, how's that going to stop under communism? Because what we're
because
doing to destroy our environment is burning fossil fuels and building automated systems which
we
run on
can
fossil.
we can
So you're
drastically
saying
halt.
if we go to communism, which I mean, I'm not. I guess I can't cite any actual communistic countries because they weren't real communism. But the USSR and all of these countries and their use of fossil fuels and how they were using, and how China and India use way more than any other country in the world, than all the other countries and all that sort of thing. But I can't use those as examples because, capitalism bad, communism good. So anything that's bad
communist.
isn't.
They're capitalist. Anyway, what I was saying though, like for instance, Alaska in the most recent. Sorry.
So China is capitalist, but they used to be communist.
They were never communist.
Never communist. Okay, so they were always capitalist, even under Mao. Okay.
I mean, certainly recent history they're capitalist. Anyway, what I was about to say, Trump. Look at his most recent, well, not Trump, the Senate even, their tax bill. Alaska is now, they've removed regulations, so they're now going to be drilling for oil in Alaska.
About time.
Well, no, why? That's destroying, like you're smiling, but you're destroying the environment for the sake of profit. That wouldn't be happening under a better system because people would say, no, this is actively harmful for both environment and humanity. And we have alternative.
How are we going to get to the renewable, and how are we going to get to that stage where we don't have to do that anymore?
Well, because we invest in.
How are we going to skip that stage?
Sorry?
How are we going to skip from where we are right now to the point where we don't burn any fossil fuels and everything's automated? How do we get from here to there without going through Alaska, without using fossil fuels?
We make a start. We remove the profit incentive. We remove the private ownership of land. We take away corporations who.
How does that remove burning fossil fuels? I'm not understanding that.
Well, for instance, we have, like, many nations in Europe have already started converting themselves from fossil fuel energy to renewable sources. Nations where there's more coal. Like in some of the countries in Scandinavia, and it's not fully yet.
Look at Germany and the amount of renewable energy they have and the amount of coal plants they build in the exact same time. They are the world leader, as far as I know, in wind and hydro, I believe. Or maybe it's wind and solar. I remember it's 2 renewable energy sources. Probably not hydro because everybody hates hydro. So it's probably wind and solar. And look at the amount of coal power plants that they have built in that same amount of time and how much their coal usage has gone up. Because wind and solar are not consistent. They're only usable while the wind is blowing, or they're only usable while the sun is shining. Whenever that stops, they have to switch over and start using coal again. And because of the inefficient process of switching back and forth between these 2 energies, they're using way more coal than they would have had they just built coal plants.
Well, even if that is accurate, like, you still find the situation that produces a planet with severe negative consequences if we continue using fossil fuels. And also, like, to suggest that it's
so my solution to that is nuclear power. We've had nuclear power for decades, and we don't switch over to that. It's not as dangerous as far as environmental effect. If you're looking for something with 0 CO2 emissions, or next to nothing as far as when it comes to CO2 emissions, nuclear power. All these people who are saying, "Oh, we're destroying our environment," why don't they encourage that over fossil fuels? But they don't. Every time I talk to someone, they're saying, "Oh no, can't use nuclear power. That's terrible. We got to stick with renewable, like solar and wind and hydro." And I'm like,
the reason people are wary of nuclear power is because of the way corporations have managed it before. Like, you look at all the various disasters. You look at the ones in India, which are worse than the ones in the West because there's even fewer regulations there. And the reason people are fearing of it is because, while there are no CO2 emissions, if you have a reactor disaster or a waste disposal that goes wrong, you've got a massive disaster. You've got land you can't use for generations.
So rather than improve that process, they're going to keep using more and more fossil fuels.
But that's the whole point, isn't it? Because they don't want, lots of corporations don't bother improving their own product because they can just make more profit by being lazy, and they're never going to face the consequences because their, like, boss doesn't live in the areas where they've dumped the thing. It's why you still see, like, in Bangladesh, I think last year, an entire factory collapsed because safety regulations weren't met whatsoever, and so this entire, like, multi-story building just folded in on itself. And that's in 2016. Like, there's no excuse for that happening. It's not like we don't know anything about buildings. It's because people don't care about the safety of their workers and the safety of the actual things they're building, as long as there's profits to be made. And if you remove that, if you have a system where workers and
again,
society is acting in the benefit of everyone, you remove that safety negligence. I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to sort of bring this to a sort of close because I'm going to have to go soon. So
okay.
I'll let you sort of.
And this has gone on way longer than I expected, and it's actually been kind of fun. I mean, I know we completely disagree, and hopefully you haven't saw this as too hostile towards you or anything like
No,
that.
I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, trying to challenge you, and I think you've challenged me as well. So I think this was a pretty decent debate. I don't think there is a winner when it comes to this sort of thing, but
yeah, no, it's more just a conversation of ideas, isn't it?
Yeah, hopefully we've made people think. That is the only real outcome we can hope for in this sort of thing. Is people listening are like, oh, I hadn't considered that. Wow, this is let me look into that. So
No, exactly.
I don't know.
It's been a pleasure having you on, though. I mean, it's certainly like it's nice to have the mind sort of active, isn't it? So
yeah. So hopefully we can do this again in the future, and maybe we'll pick a less
contentious.
Yeah, less contentious. That's a good word. Less contentious topic. So maybe we'll have some area where we agree on. I haven't seen it yet, but maybe we'll find some topic that we can both agree on.
Maybe.
All right.
Anyway, to everyone listening, thank you for sticking with us for the over 2 hours of this has gone on for. And I'll join you all next time.
All right.